The smoke from a Thompson submachine gun clearing in a Chicago bowling alley. A man collapsing face forward into a plate of pasta in a Coney Island restaurant. A couple torn apart by 167 armor-piercing rounds on a Louisiana dirt road. An eye doctor bleeding out against a brick wall. 10 files pulled from the deepest, darkest cabinets of the underworld archives. 10 lives defined by immense greed, extreme violence, and a desperate need for control over their miserable environments. We are not here to celebrate these names or build them up into folk heroes. We are here to document the wreckage they left behind, the innocent civilian lives they casually extinguished, and the deeply pathetic ends they all eventually met. This is the archivist speaking, and today we are opening the permanent ledgers on the men and women who thought they could outrun the law, only to find themselves cornered and put down like rabid dogs. Before we strike the match on the first file, take a quick second to look around your room. If you find yourself double-checking the deadbolt on your front door tonight, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. It tells the algorithm you appreciate a thorough historical autopsy. And leaving a like on the video would not hurt either. Just consider it your weekly protection money so the syndicates of the internet keep delivering these unredacted files directly to your feed. We have 10 highly detailed ledgers to get through today. Let us not waste a single second more. Brooklyn was a dense, suffocating maze of brick and rusted iron fire escapes in the summer of 1939. In the neighborhood of Brownsville, the air tasted heavily of coal ash boiling cabbage and unwashed bodies packed tightly into tenement housing. It was a miserable place where extreme poverty broke working men over its knee on a daily basis. Right at the corner of Saratoga and Livonia Avenues sat Midnight Rose's candy store. On the surface, it was a harmless place to buy a nickel egg cream or a cheap cigar. But in the dim back room, hanging on stained floral wallpaper, was a single black rotary payphone. That specific phone was the central nervous system for a syndicate the newspapers would later dub Murder Incorporated. And waiting patiently by that phone on any given afternoon was a man named Harry Strauss. The papers called him Pittsburgh Phil, though there is zero historical record of him ever setting foot anywhere near Pennsylvania. Harry was born in Williamsburg in 1909 to Jewish immigrants who spent their entire days hunched over heavy sewing machines. The needle trades were backbreaking, miserable work for absolute pennies, and Harry looked at his parents' blistered, calloused hands and decided early on that he would never sweat for a living. He started as a common street punk, shaking down local pushcart vendors and stealing whatever was not explicitly bolted to the concrete sidewalks. By the time he was a teenager, he had graduated from petty theft to cracking skulls for neighborhood loan sharks. He had a natural, disturbing aptitude for inflicting severe physical pain without his pulse going up a single beat. He was small in stature, intensely vain, and prone to extreme violent outbursts whenever he felt disrespected. He suffered from a severe case of short man syndrome, compensating for his lack of physical size with pure, unadulterated aggro. When Louis Lepke Buchalter and Albert Anastasia organized the official enforcement arm of the National Crime Syndicate, they needed men who did not ask moral questions. Harry Strauss was their absolute crown jewel. He was quickly placed on a permanent syndicate retainer. He earned a flat salary of $125 a week, which is roughly $2,600 in today's money, just to remain on standby in the candy store. When a contract was actually handed down, he received a bonus ranging from $500 to $2,000, upwards of $42,000 today. Harry did not kill out of personal revenge or heated passion. He killed because a voice on the rotary phone at Midnight Rose's gave him a name and a physical address. It was a corporate assembly line, and he was the lead mechanic. I usually keep neutral when digging through these old case files, but the logistics of this operation are objectively absurd. The idea that a man could clock in, pick up a 60-cent ice pick from a local hardware store, drive across town to alter the hierarchy of the American Mafia, and then go home to eat a quiet pot roast is extremely difficult to process. Harry prided himself on his deadly versatility. He used heavy shotguns, stolen revolvers, thick ropes, and drowning in the East River. But his absolute tool of choice was the common ice pick. It was perfectly quiet. It left almost no blood if you knew exactly where to push it into the body, and it could never be traced by police ballistics. He operated primarily alongside another Brownsville local named Abe Rellis, known on the street as Kid Twist. Rellis was a fireplug of a man. He was loud, incredibly crude, and deeply jealous of anyone who garnered more respect than him. Harry and Abe were partners in blood, but Abe always silently resented Harry's extreme vanity. Harry would routinely show up to a contract killing wearing a custom-tailored silk suit that cost $100 over $2,000 today. He got daily manicures and slicked his hair back with expensive oils. He viewed himself as a high-class professional executive of death. Abe just viewed him as an arrogant, overly dressed thug. They worked efficiently together despite the constant underlying friction. In 1939, the syndicate ordered a hit on a small-time bookie named Puggy Feinstein. Puggy had crossed a major capo and needed to be made a permanent example of. Harry and Abe invited Puggy into a Brooklyn safe house under the guise of a business meeting. The moment he walked through the heavy wooden door, they overpowered him, threw him to the floor, and bound his hands and feet with thick industrial wire. Harry calmly punctured Puggy's chest with an ice pick multiple times, purposely avoiding the heart to ensure the man felt the entire transition from life to death. They then loaded the bleeding body into the trunk of a stolen drop car, drove to a vacant dirt lot in Canarsie, dumped 2 gallons of gasoline over the corpse, and struck a match. The medical examiner later determined Puggy was likely still drawing shallow breaths when the fire initially started. Harry walked away from the blazing inferno without a single smudge of ash on his expensive lapels. But the heavy machinery of murder is sloppy by its very nature. You cannot manufacture that much death without eventually spilling collateral blood. Which brings us to the morning of July the 25th, 1939. The target was Philip Orlovsky, an official in the Garment Workers Union who had decided to cooperate with the district attorney. Orlovsky was slated to testify against Louis Lepke, a move that carried an automatic death sentence from the syndicate. Harry Strauss and another button man named Emanuel Mendy Weiss were dispatched directly to the Bronx to handle the problem permanently. They parked a stolen sedan near Orlovsky's apartment building and waited in the muggy morning heat. They only had a general description of the man: medium build, graying hair, wearing a specific style of brown fedora. At exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, a 51-year-old man stepped out of the heavy brass doors of the apartment building and began walking toward the local subway station. His name was Irving Penn. He was a sheet music publisher. He had a wife, children, and a completely clean, spotless record. He spent his days arranging musical notes and reviewing piano scores in a quiet office. He had never met a mobster or a contract killer in his entire life. But he unfortunately lived in the exact same building as Orlovsky. He was of a very similar physical build, and he happened to be wearing a similar brown fedora to block the morning sun. Harry Strauss did not bother to verify the target. He did not instruct his driver to pull the car up so he could ask for a name. As Irving Penn stepped off, the concrete curb tires screeched against the pavement. The stolen sedan lurched forward rapidly. Harry leaned out the open passenger window with a heavy .38 caliber revolver and pulled the trigger repeatedly. 5 hot rounds struck Irving Penn directly in the back and shoulder. He collapsed hard onto the rough, dirty concrete, his briefcases bursting open, sending crisp sheet music scattering into the oily street water. He bled out on the street long before the ambulance ever arrived. A completely innocent man wiped off the face of the earth simply because he wore a popular style of hat. The murder of Irving Penn was just another routine Tuesday for Harry Strauss. He collected his fat bonus envelope from the candy store and went right back to his daily manicures and expensive steak dinners. He did not realize that the spilled blood of a civilian music publisher would be the very acid that dissolved his entire criminal empire. The massive public outcry over an innocent man being gunned down in broad daylight forced the city's hand. Brooklyn District Attorney William O'Dwyer launched an aggressive, relentless crusade against the Brownsville Syndicate. The plot flooded the streets of Brooklyn. The cops started kicking in doors, shaking down local jug markers, rounding up every known associate of Midnight Rose's candy store, and throwing them into interrogation rooms. The legal pressure was absolutely suffocating, and under that intense heat, the supposed toughest men in the neighborhood began to fracture. Abe Relis, Harry's partner, his shadow nemesis, was arrested and faced a guaranteed one-way trip to the electric chair. When faced with his own strict mortality, the brutal, ruthless Kid Twist completely folded in on himself. He decided to break the sacred underworld code of silence. He became a cooperating witness for the state of New York, which, as you can probably tell, severely annoys me as an archivist because once a man like Relis starts making backroom deals, the official historical records get heavily redacted and certain pieces of physical evidence from the 73rd Precinct conveniently vanish into thin air to protect the state's brand new asset. Relis gave O'Dwyer absolutely everything. He gave them the names, the exact dates, the locations of shallow graves out in the New Jersey meadowlands, the specific weapons drops. He sang loudly and clearly, and the very first name he eagerly offered up to save his own miserable skin was Harry Strauss. The police picked Harry up in a high-end Manhattan barber shop while he was getting a hot towel shave. When the heavy legal indictment was finally read, charging him with the brutal murder of Irving Penn and several others, Harry realized the absolute concrete trap he was stuck in. He knew the state had his partner's sworn testimony. He knew he was going to burn in the chair. So the impeccably dressed, arrogant executive of death decided to put on a theatrical show. If he could not win on the cold facts, he would try to win by claiming complete legal insanity. Harry Strauss intentionally stopped bathing. He stopped shaving his face. The custom silk suits were quickly replaced by unwashed, heavily stained prison-issued jumpsuits. He allowed his hair to grow out into a greasy, matted nest. When he was finally dragged into the Kings County courtroom by the screws, he looked exactly like a feral creature dragged directly out of a storm drain. He refused to speak a single word to his own highly paid defense attorneys. He spent the entire proceedings aggressively muttering to himself, swatting at invisible flies in the stale courtroom air, and periodically howling loudly at the presiding judge. During the lead prosecutor's opening statements, Harry leaned forward over the wooden defense table and began violently chewing on the thick leather strap of his lawyer's briefcase. It was a pathetic, completely transparent performance. The jury sat in the box and watched this former feared hitman act exactly like a toddler throwing a tantrum on the floor. The judge brought in top state psychiatrists who observed Harry for less than a single hour before declaring under oath that he was entirely legally sane and aggressively faking the entire episode to avoid the executioner. The jury deliberated for a remarkably short amount of time. They returned a firm verdict of guilty on all counts of first-degree murder. The mandatory sentence was death. Harry dropped the elaborate insanity act the exact moment the heavy wooden gavel fell. The feral howling stopped, instantly replaced by a cold, dead, silent stare directed at the floor. On June the 12th, 1941, Harry Strauss sat in the pre-execution facility at Sing Sing Prison, a dreaded cell block known entirely among the inmates as the dance hall. Outside the thick concrete walls, the Hudson River moved slowly under a dark, moonless night. Inside, the stagnant air was heavily disinfected, smelling sharply of industrial bleach and old copper. The state electrician repeatedly tested the voltage on the heavy oak chair sitting bolted to the floor in the center of the execution chamber. Old Sparky was waiting patiently. At exactly 11 o'clock at night, the heavy steel door of Harry's cell swung open with a loud metallic clank. Two massive prison guards stepped inside. Harry did not put up a fight. The volatile street punk, who had personally extinguished roughly 30 human lives for a weekly paycheck, had absolutely no fight left in his small frame. His head had been shaved completely bald by the prison barber. A small slit was cut into the right leg of his rough canvas trousers to allow the heavy metal electrode to make direct contact with his bare skin. He walked the extremely short distance down the brightly lit corridor. He stepped into the execution chamber. The designated state witnesses sat tightly in folding wooden chairs behind a thick glass partition, watching the man who had once terrorized all of New York shuffle forward slowly in cheap canvas slippers. The guards forced him down hard into the unyielding oak chair and began securing the heavy, rigid leather straps tightly around his chest, his arms, and his legs. A thick sea sponge, soaked entirely in heavy brine, was placed directly on his bare scalp to rapidly conduct the electrical current. A thick leather mask was pulled down firmly over his face, leaving only his mouth exposed to the sterile room. The prison warden stepped forward, holding a silver pocket watch in his hand. He asked Harry if he had any final words before the sentence of the court was carried out. Harry stared straight ahead through the small dark eye holes of the leather mask. He did not offer a tearful apology to the grieving widow of Irving Penn. He did not curse the name of Abbe Relais. He remained completely and utterly silent. As the warden stepped back to the wall, Harry slowly opened his mouth, bit down hard on the heavy leather chin strap securing his jaw, and began to chew. That was his final pathetic act on this earth, chewing on a piece of salted leather. The heavy switch on the wall was thrown forward. 2,000 volts of raw electricity surged violently through his body. His fists clenched tight. His small body slammed incredibly hard against the thick leather restraints, and gray smoke curled slowly from the damp sponge resting on his head. 2 minutes later, the chief prison physician stepped forward, placed a cold metal stethoscope to his chest, and officially pronounced Harry Strauss dead. The massive criminal organization he helped build collapsed very shortly after his body was buried. His betrayer, Abe Relais, did not live long enough to truly enjoy his state-granted immunity. On November the 12th, 1941, while being closely guarded by 6 armed police officers in room 623 of the Half Moon Hotel in Coney Island, Relais somehow managed to fall out of the window. His body plummeted and slammed hard into a lower concrete roof extension. The official ruling by the corrupt police force was an accidental fall during a botched escape attempt, though gravity very rarely works horizontally. The state's favorite canary could sing, but he certainly could not fly. Murder Incorporated was officially dissolved into the very concrete it was built upon. Up north, the city concrete was cold and highly unforgiving, but the criminal element was structured exactly like a strict corporate ledger. Down in the sweltering, oppressive heat of the southern states, the air did not carry the smell of coal ash or boiling cabbage. It carried the dry dust of the deep piney woods, the sharp scent of spent gunpowder, and the thick black exhaust of a stolen Ford 5.8 tearing recklessly down a deeply rutted dirt highway. The rigid structure of the city syndicate meant absolutely nothing out in the muddy, unforgiving scrubland. Out there, survival was strictly a matter of raw speed, and an absolute boiling hatred for the badge was bred directly into the bone from birth. Up north, the city concrete was cold and highly unforgiving, but the criminal element was structured exactly like a strict corporate ledger. Down in the sweltering, oppressive heat of the southern states, the air did not carry the smell of coal ash or boiling cabbage. It carried the dry dust of the deep piney woods, the sharp scent of spent gunpowder, and the thick black exhaust of a stolen Ford 5.8 tearing recklessly down a deeply rutted dirt highway. The rigid structure of the city syndicate meant absolutely nothing out in the muddy, unforgiving scrubland. Out there, survival was strictly a matter of raw speed, and an absolute boiling hatred for the badge was bred directly into the bone from birth. I usually maintain strict neutrality when pulling these files, but the sheer volume of Hollywood romanticism injected into these two particular sociopaths over the last 90 years makes my teeth grind. The silver screen portrays them as glamorous, star-crossed lovers fighting against a corrupt banking system. The physical evidence inside the archivist's cabinet tells a completely different, deeply pathetic story. They did not rob massive bank vaults. They robbed independent, rural grocery stores and isolated gas stations, usually terrorizing working-class citizens for a handful of crumpled dollar bills. They spent weeks on end sleeping in the cramped back seats of stolen sedans, their clothes stiff with dried sweat and old blood nursing festering gunshot wounds, while bathing in freezing drainage ditches. They were not modern-day Robin Hoods. They were rabid animals backed into a corner of their own making. Clyde Chestnut Barrow was born into a level of poverty that is difficult to accurately articulate. His family moved to West Dallas, an unincorporated shantytown known locally as the Bog. It was a sprawling camp of canvas tents and shacks constructed from discarded tin roofing and rotting wood. Raw sewage ran directly through the unpaved dirt streets. Clyde started his criminal career stealing turkeys and cracking open small-town penny arcades. He was a frail, unremarkable kid who quickly developed a massive chip on his shoulder to compensate for his short stature. By 1929, he had escalated to stealing cars and cracking rural safes. He was just another low-level punk, heading exactly where the system designed him to put him away. Bonnie Elizabeth Parker was not some innocent flower swept away by a dark, handsome stranger. She was fiercely intelligent, deeply bored, and desperate for any distraction from the grinding monotony of her life in Cement City, Texas. She had dropped out of high school at 16 to marry a local thug named Roy Thornton. Thornton beat her regularly and eventually landed himself a 5-year stretch in state prison. Bonnie never bothered to officially divorce him. When she met Clyde in 1930, she saw a ticket out of the dust. She did not care where the ticket led as long as it involved forward momentum and absolute chaos. The true genesis of the Barrow Gang's extreme violence can be traced back to a specific geographic coordinate in Houston County, Texas. Camp 1 of the Eastham Prison Farm. Clyde was sentenced to 14 years of hard labor in 1930. Eastham was not a rehabilitation center. It was a brutal, sweltering agricultural gulag where men chopped cotton under the blistering Texas sun, while mounted guards known strictly as the Plod or the Screws beat them relentlessly with heavy leather bats. For a small-framed kid like Clyde, the physical labor was only half the torture. He was repeatedly and violently assaulted by a hulking inmate named Ed Crowder. The prison administration completely ignored the assaults. They let the inmates regulate themselves through raw, unchecked violence. This extreme physical and mental trauma did not break Clyde Barrow into submission. It completely rewired his brain. He entered Eastham as a petty car thief and morphed into a deeply paranoid, hyper-violent sociopath. In October of 1931, Clyde found a heavy piece of lead pipe in the prison machine shop. He walked quietly up behind Ed Crowder in the cell block and swung the pipe with every ounce of strength he possessed, crushing Crowder's skull into jagged fragments. Another inmate serving a life sentence took the official blame to spare Clyde a trip to the electric chair. A few months later, desperate to escape the grueling field work, Clyde convinced another prisoner to take a sharp wood-chopping axe and sever 2 of his toes on his left foot. He limped heavily for the rest of his short life. The supreme irony is that his mother had successfully petitioned the Texas governor for his release. His parole papers were officially signed just days after he mutilated himself. Clyde Barrow walked out of Eastham on crutches, deeply embittered, carrying a permanent burning hatred for the entire Texas penal system. He swore he would never be taken alive again. Over the next 2 years, Clyde and Bonnie dragged a rotating cast of low-level thugs across the American Midwest, leaving a wide, messy trail of brass casings and shattered glass. The newspapers printed their photos and called them the Barrow Gang. The public ate up the photographs Bonnie took of herself, chomping on a thick cigar and holding a revolver, unaware it was just a prop for a private joke. The reality of their daily existence was incredibly bleak. They lived strictly out of stolen Ford 5.8 automobiles, chosen specifically for their heavy steel bodies and superior engine speed. They ate cold canned beans, drove endlessly through the night, and constantly watched the rearview mirror. They rarely managed to steal more than a few $100s at a time. In one grocery store holed up in Hillsboro, Texas, they murdered the store owner over a cash register containing exactly $28, which is barely $700 in today's money. A man's entire life extinguished for the cost of a modern television set. The violence escalated rapidly because Clyde had absolutely zero trigger discipline and panicked at the first sign of a uniform. We must pause here to open the file on Constable William Campbell, known to his friends as Cal. Campbell was a 60-year-old widower living in the small mining town of Commerce, Oklahoma. He was a single father raising young children, a quiet man who spent his days directing traffic and dealing with local drunks. On the morning of April the 6th, 1934, Campbell and the local police chief pulled their cruiser up to a muddy intersection on a rural dirt road just outside of town. They had received a call about a suspicious vehicle parked in the heavy brush. It was just a routine check. They did not know that the mud-splattered Ford 5.8 contained Clyde Bonney and another gang member named Henry Methvin. As Campbell stepped out of his vehicle, his boots sinking into the wet red clay, he simply asked the occupants what they were doing out there. Clyde Barrow did not attempt to negotiate. He did not attempt to start the engine and flee. He simply raised a heavy Browning automatic rifle, a military-grade weapon stolen from a National Guard armory, and squeezed the trigger. The heavy .30 caliber rounds tore entirely through Campbell's chest, throwing his body violently backward into the deep mud. He died instantly, his blood pooling quickly in the tire tracks. Chief Percy Boyd was shot directly through the head but miraculously survived. A 60-year-old single father was butchered in the dirt simply because he asked a question. This was the actual reality of the Barrow Gang. No honor, no code, just blind, deafening panic and collateral damage. On Easter Sunday, April the 1st, 1934, the gang crossed a line that the state could no longer ignore. They were parked on a muddy shoulder near Grapevine, Texas. Two highway patrolmen, E.B. Wheeler and H.D. Murphy, pulled up to offer assistance, thinking it was a stalled motorist. It was Murphy's very first day on the job. He still had the crisp factory tags on his pristine uniform. As they approached Clyde, and Henry Methvin opened fire with heavy shotguns. Wheeler was killed instantly. Murphy, lying wounded in the dirt, was shot at point-blank range. The governor of Texas authorized a massive manhunt and placed a direct bounty of $1,000 on their heads, roughly $23,000 in today's currency, for the absolute destruction of the gang. They brought in former Texas Ranger Captain Frank Hamer to lead the hunt. Hamer was the absolute antithesis of Clyde Barrow. He was a towering, heavily scarred veteran of dozens of actual gunfights. He did not crave newspaper headlines. He did not consider Bonnie Parker a romantic gun moll. He viewed them both as rabid dogs that needed to be put down. Hamer recognized immediately that chasing the stolen Fords across state lines was a complete waste of gasoline. He completely ignored their chaotic movements and instead sat down in a quiet room with a map tracking their familial connections. He realized the gang constantly moved in a large circular pattern, always eventually circling back to visit their relatives in Dallas or Louisiana. Hamer simply figured out where the geographic circle intersected, and he drove there to wait. Hamer reached out to the father of Henry Methvin, a man named Ivy Methvin, who lived in Bienville Parish, Louisiana. Hamer offered a completely off-the-books deal. If Ivy helped set up the ambush, his son Henry would receive a full state pardon for his crimes in Texas. Ivy agreed immediately. The trap was laid meticulously. On the morning of May the 23rd, 1934, Hamer and a posse of 5 other heavily armed lawmen concealed themselves in the thick, humid brush along Highway 154, a narrow, rutted dirt road near Gibbsland, Louisiana. They parked Ivy Methvin's large logging truck directly in the road and removed one of the heavy wooden wheels, staging it to look like a mechanical breakdown. The posse settled into the wet grass, checking the actions on their Remington Model 8 rifles and Thompson submachine guns. They waited quietly in the stifling morning heat. At exactly 9:15 in the morning, the distinct roar of a flathead V8 engine echoed through the tall pine trees. The tan 1934 Ford came tearing around the bend at high speed. Clyde was driving the vehicle in his socks. Bonnie was in the passenger seat wearing a red dress, eating a half-bitten sandwich. As they approached the staged logging truck, Clyde recognized Ivy Methvin standing safely off to the side of the road. He applied the heavy drum brakes. The Ford slowed down, the tires crunching loudly against the gravel and packed dirt. Hamer stepped forward from the brush, raising his heavy rifle. He did not read them their rights. He did not demand a formal surrender. He yelled a single sharp command to his men, and the woods erupted. The gunfire was absolutely deafening. 6 men unleashing fully automatic and heavy rifle fire simultaneously into a stationary target. The very first round fired was from Deputy Prentice Oakley's Remington. It traveled straight through the driver's side window, penetrated Clyde Barrow's left temple, and exited the right side of his skull, killing him before his brain could even process the sound of the gunshot. The heavy Ford, still engaged in forward gear, rolled slowly down into the muddy ditch, as the posse continued to pour hot lead into the steel body. The heavy window glass shattered into thousands of tiny fragments. The steel doors were completely shredded, peeling back like thin tinfoil. There was no dramatic final standoff. There was no time for a tearful goodbye. Bonnie Parker's final words were never recorded because she did not have a single second to draw breath. She released a high-pitched, piercing scream as the first volley hit Clyde, and then the heavy .30 caliber rounds tore violently into her own body. The posse emptied their primary weapons, dropped them in the dirt, drew their heavy revolvers, walked directly up to the smoking, shattered vehicle, and continued firing through the shattered windows until every single hammer clicked empty. 167 armor-piercing rounds were fired in less than 20 seconds. The interior of the car was a completely unrecognizable slaughterhouse. The sandwich Bonnie had been eating was covered in thick blood and shattered safety glass. The heavy smoke hung thickly in the humid Louisiana air. The deafening roar of the guns was completely replaced by the hissing of the punctured radiator and the dripping of vital fluids into the red dirt. When the local deputies finally managed to pry the shredded trunk of the Ford open, they found an armory capable of supplying a small militia. 3 stolen Browning automatic rifles, a dozen heavy revolvers, 2 sawed-off shotguns, and over 3,000 rounds of armor-piercing ammunition. All of it entirely useless against a perfectly executed ambush. Almost immediately, the gruesome public spectacle began. Locals from the nearby town heard the sustained gunfire and swarmed the dirt highway. Before the coroner even arrived on the scene, the crowd descended on the shattered vehicle like vultures. Men used pocket knives to dig bloody slugs out of the surrounding pine trees. One man actively tried to cut off Clyde's severely mutilated left ear as a souvenir before a lawman physically threw him backward into the muddy ditch. Another local aggressively grabbed torn pieces of Bonnie's blood-soaked dress. Bonnie Parker was 23 years old. When they finally pulled her ruined body from the passenger seat, they found she was still wearing the cheap metal wedding ring from her first husband, Roy Thornton, the man she had abandoned for a life of supposed freedom. Clyde Barrow was 25. They were hauled back into town, their bodies laid out on wooden slabs, heavily embalmed to mask the massive tissue damage, and put on direct display for tens of thousands of gawking spectators. The legendary outlaws were reduced to mangled carnival exhibits. Frank Hamer collected his agreed-upon payment. He walked away from the ambush site without a single scratch on his tall frame. Decades later, when interviewed by reporters, eager for a dramatic quote about the morality of gunning down a woman without warning, Hamer stared them dead in the eye and stated simply that he would do it exactly the same way all over again. He died quietly in his sleep in 1955, a highly decorated hero of Texas. The stolen Ford V8, completely riddled with jagged bullet holes and stained deeply with dried blood, was dragged across the country for decades, displayed at country fairs, and eventually a casino in Nevada, serving as the ultimate pathetic monument to a pair of small-time thieves who confused sheer brutality with actual power. Out in the scrubland, survival was a matter of raw speed, but eventually everyone runs out of road. In the dense, mechanized heart of the big Midwestern cities, however, the violence was not a chaotic chase. It was a highly calculated business strategy orchestrated by men in expensive suits who preferred to outsource their butchery to men with very fast hands. The icy wind coming off Lake Michigan in the winter of 1923 carried the distinct heavy smells of the Union stockyards and cheap, unregulated bathtub gin. Chicago was a rapidly expanding industrial machine, divided sharply by ethnic boundary lines and controlled entirely by extreme violence. In the dense, unpaved neighborhoods of the West Side, the newly arrived Italian immigrants did not fear the local police force. They feared a shadowy extortion ring known simply as the Black Hand. The Mano Nera did not operate sophisticated bootlegging empires. They operated on raw fear. They sent crude letters written in heavy charcoal adorned with crude drawings of daggers and bleeding skulls demanding weekly payments. If a local shopkeeper refused to pay the extortion fee, their business was bombed into rubble or they were simply shot in the back of the head in a dark alley. Vincenzo Antonio Garibaldi was born in the coastal town of Licata, Sicily, in 1902, before his mother packed him onto a crowded steamer bound for the suffocating tenement buildings of America. By the time he was a teenager living in Chicago, Vincenzo had completely abandoned his birth name. The local boxing promoters told him that Irish fighters drew much larger crowds and better gambling odds, so the muscular catacomb, incredibly fast young immigrant stepped into the blood-stained canvas rings under the name Battling Jack McGurn. He was a highly skilled welterweight, fast on his feet, with a devastating right hook. He earned decent money, legally taking severe physical beatings for the entertainment of screaming factory workers. His mother had remarried a quiet, hard-working grocery store owner named Angelo DeMori. Angelo was a proud man who worked 18-hour days stacking heavy crates of produce. When the Black Hand extortionists dropped a charcoal letter on his wooden counter demanding a heavy cut of his meager profits, Angelo flatly refused to pay. He believed in the promise of the new country. He believed the law would protect him. He was completely wrong. On January the 28th, 1923, Angelo was closing up his grocery store. 3 men stepped out of the freezing shadows and shot him repeatedly in the chest and neck. He bled out on the dirty cobblestones right in front of his own business. The police ledgers from the early 1920s are notoriously spotty, mostly because half the precinct captains were actively taking bribes, which usually annoys me to no end as an archivist. But the street-level justice of the era was incredibly straightforward. Vincenzo did not bother going to the corrupt local detectives. He took his boxing earnings and purchased a heavy military-grade Thompson submachine gun. The 1921 model featured a heavy-finned barrel and a 50-round drum magazine. Vincenzo spent weeks quietly tracking the 3 specific Black Hand enforcers responsible for his stepfather's murder. He did not confront them in the street. He systematically hunted them down one by one, ambushing them in dark alleyways and outside local social clubs, emptying the heavy .45 caliber weapon into their bodies. He completely eradicated the local extortion ring single-handedly. His extreme efficiency and total lack of hesitation did not go unnoticed in the underworld. Alphonse Capone was rapidly building the Chicago outfit, taking over the massive illicit alcohol trade, and he needed young, ruthless men to enforce his strictly defined territorial borders. Capone reached out to the young boxer and offered him a highly lucrative position as a chief enforcer. McGurn was placed on a permanent retainer of $500 a week, which is roughly $8,500 in today's money, just to remain on call. On top of his salary, he was given ownership stakes in several highly profitable speakeasies, including the infamous D nightclub. He dressed in custom-tailored silk suits, drove incredibly expensive touring cars, and carried the heavy Thompson in a custom-fitted violin case. The sensationalist newspapers quickly caught wind of his violent exploits and branded him Machine Gun Jack McGurn. He absolutely despised the nickname, preferring to view himself as a legitimate businessman, but the bloody moniker was permanently etched into the public consciousness. The massive wealth generated by the Prohibition era created a volatile, incredibly unstable ecosystem. Capone controlled the south side of the city, but the north side was tightly held by a heavily armed, vicious Irish syndicate led by George Bugs Moran. Moran is our primary shadow nemesis in this ledger. He was a towering, deeply unstable man who absolutely hated Capone on a personal, visceral level. He routinely referred to Capone in the press as a lowlife and a beast. Moran actively hijacked Capone's highly expensive liquor shipments, gunned down his closest associates, and completely refused to negotiate any form of territorial truce. He was a massive thorn in the side of the outfit, costing them hundreds of thousands of dollars in lost revenue and broken equipment. By early 1929, Capone had completely lost his patience. He handed the problem directly to Jack McGurn and gave him a massive budget to completely eliminate the leadership of the North Side gang. McGurn did not plan a chaotic drive-by shooting. He planned a highly structured, flawless military ambush. He rented a small room across the street from the SMC Cartage Company garage at 2122 North Clark Street. The heavy brick building was Moran's primary liquor drop and mechanical shop. McGurn set up a spotter in the room window and orchestrated a fake telephone call to Moran, offering a massive shipment of hijacked old log cabin whiskey at an incredibly low price. The delivery was scheduled for the freezing morning of February the 14th. McGurn knew that Moran's men would recognize any local Chicago hitters, so he imported outside talent from St. Louis and Detroit. He also secured 2 stolen Chicago Police Department uniforms and a heavy Cadillac touring car, which was carefully painted and modified to look exactly like an official detective's squad car, complete with a heavy brass siren mounted on the running board. The trap was set perfectly. But we need to pause the timeline here to open a very specific, highly tragic file. Let us look at Dr. Reinhard H. Schwimmer. He was 29 years old, a licensed optometrist with a highly successful, completely legitimate practice located in the prestigious Capitol building. He lived a comfortable, quiet life at the Parkway Hotel. He had absolutely zero criminal record. He did not run illegal alcohol. He did not carry a weapon. But Schwimmer had a severe, fatal personality flaw. He was deeply fascinated by the criminal underworld. He thought mobsters were glamorous. He routinely offered free eye exams to Moran's men just so he could hang around them and hear their violent stories. He actively boasted to his wealthy, legitimate friends about his dark connections. I usually keep completely neutral when pulling these old files, but the absolute sheer stupidity of a licensed medical professional intentionally hanging around a mob liquor drop just for street credibility is completely baffling to me. On that freezing Thursday morning, Schwimmer put on his heavy wool overcoat, adjusted his expensive silk tie, and walked over to the SMC Cartage garage just to hang out with the gang while they waited for the whiskey delivery. He was a complete civilian, entirely unarmed, standing in the absolute worst geographical location on the entire planet. At exactly 10:30 in the morning, the heavy black Cadillac pulled up directly in front of the garage. 2 men wearing crisp police uniforms and heavy brass badges stepped out, followed closely by 2 men in civilian overcoats. They walked briskly through the front doors of the unheated garage. Inside, 7 men were waiting for the truck. When they saw the uniforms, they completely relaxed. They assumed it was just a routine shakedown by the local plod. They did exactly what they were told. They turned around and lined up shoulder to shoulder facing the cold brick wall. Dr. Reinhard Schwimmer stood right in the middle of the line, his hands resting against the rough masonry, completely unaware that his thrill-seeking had just cost him his life. The 2 plainclothes men stepped forward and threw open their heavy woolen overcoats. They raised 2 Thompson submachine guns. One was loaded with a heavy 50-round drum magazine, the other with a standard 20-round box. They did not read any rights. They simply pulled the triggers and held them down. 70 rounds of heavy .45 caliber ammunition tore violently through the 7 men in a matter of seconds. The deafening roar of the heavy weapons completely filled the small garage, echoing off the brick walls and the concrete floor. The men were practically sawed in half by the crossfire. The brick wall behind them was completely pulverized, sending a thick cloud of red dust into the freezing air. The bodies slumped heavily to the oily floor in a massive, tangled pile of torn fabric and shattered bone. Schwimmer was hit 14 times. His expensive wool suit was immediately soaked through with thick blood. A heavy round completely shattered his jaw, while another pulverized his pocket watch, freezing the hands permanently at 10:30. The shooters then handed their weapons to the plainclothes men, put their hands in the air, and were marched out of the garage by the uniformed men, making it look exactly like a successful police raid to any passing witnesses. It was a masterclass in violent logistics, but it failed in its primary objective. George Bugs Moran was running late that morning. He had walked toward the garage, saw the police car parked out front, and immediately turned around to wait in a nearby coffee shop. The entire massacre, the sheer volume of blood, and the death of an innocent civilian completely missed the only man it was actually designed to kill. When the police began kicking in doors across the city, they immediately looked for Jack McGurn. But McGurn had engineered a flawless alibi. He had checked into room 1919 at the luxurious Stevens Hotel on the evening of February the 13th, alongside his 22-year-old girlfriend, a highly attractive woman named Louise Rolfe. They stayed locked inside that hotel room for 3 straight days, ordering room service and leaving a massive paper trail of receipts. When the detectives finally dragged them into the interrogation room, Rolfe remained absolutely ice cold. She swore under oath that they had never left the bed. The newspapers immediately dubbed her the Blonde Alibi. The state prosecutors tried desperately to break her story, but she never wavered a single inch. Lacking any physical evidence, placing him at the garage, the state was completely forced to drop all murder charges against McGurn. He walked out of the precinct a free man, marrying Rolfe shortly after. He thought he had purchased permanent safety. But the grave does not respect a thick wallet. The sheer brutality of the St. Valentine's Day massacre completely changed the landscape of American law enforcement. It brought the full heavy weight of the federal government crashing down on the Chicago outfit. The public was completely outraged by the slaughter of 7 men in broad daylight. Within a few years, Prohibition was officially repealed. Alphonse Capone was relentlessly pursued by federal tax agents convicted of severe tax evasion and shipped off to a cold concrete cell in Alcatraz. Without Capone's massive political protection and endless funds, Jack McGurn was completely abandoned by the new leadership of the outfit. They viewed him as a massive liability, a walking billboard for police harassment. His lucrative speakeasies were shut down. His weekly salary was completely severed. Desperate for a new identity, McGurn attempted to reinvent himself as a professional athlete. He was genuinely talented at golf, and in August of 1933, he entered the prestigious Western Open golf tournament at the Olympia Fields Country Club, registering under his real name, Vincent Gibaldi. He actually shot a highly impressive 73 on the first day of the tournament, but the Chicago Police Department had absolutely no intention of letting a mass murderer walk the manicured greens. A heavy squad of detectives, led directly by Chief John Steggy, marched right onto the second hole of the course. They did not wait for him to finish his putt. They aggressively grabbed him by his tailored collar, slapped heavy iron cuffs on his wrists in front of the wealthy country club members, and dragged him off the course, arresting him on a petty vagrancy charge. It was a completely calculated, deeply humiliating public spectacle. A man who once commanded an army of killers was violently dragged through the sand traps like a common street vagrant. By 1936, McGurn was completely broke. He lived in a tiny, cheap apartment and managed a small, failing bowling alley just to pay for his groceries. He was completely stripped of his power, his expensive silk suits, and his terrifying reputation. The syndicate had completely moved on without him. On the freezing night of February the 15th, 1936, exactly 1 day after the 7th anniversary of the infamous massacre, McGurn was alone inside the Avenue Recreation Bowling Alley at 805 North Milwaukee Avenue. It was past midnight. The air smelled of floor wax and stale cigar smoke. He was standing on the polished wood lanes, throwing a few heavy frames by himself. The front door of the alley swung open. 3 men wearing heavy dark overcoats walked into the bright fluorescent light. They did not announce their syndicate affiliation. They did not offer a dramatic monologue. One of the men simply pulled a heavy revolver and shouted for everyone to stick their hands up. McGurn turned around slowly, his bowling ball still resting on the wooden return rack. The first heavy lead round struck him directly in the back of the head, shattering his skull and dropping him face first onto the highly polished hardwood floor. The shooters walked up to his twitching body and fired 2 more rounds point blank into his upper spine, severing his central nervous system completely. There was no final defiant speech. There were no dramatic last words. He simply stopped breathing in the dust and floor wax. The killers did not attempt to rob the cash register. They did not take his cheap wristwatch. Instead, one of the men reached into his heavy overcoat, pulled out a small, incredibly cheap paper card, and dropped it directly next to McGurn's bleeding head. It was a comic Valentine's Day greeting card. The printed text on the front read, "You have lost your job. You have lost your dough, your jewels and cars and handsome houses. But things could still be worse, you know? At least you haven't lost your trousers." The police never identified the 3 men in the heavy overcoats. The official ledger remains completely blank. Louise Rolfe, the famous blonde alibi, had completely grown tired of his massive gambling debts and violent temper. She had officially filed for a divorce, citing extreme mental cruelty shortly before his assassination. She married another minor, highly forgettable mobster and lived a completely quiet, obscure life until she passed away from natural causes in 1995. George Bugs Moran, the towering nemesis who survived the massive garage ambush by pure luck, did not meet a glorious end either. He completely lost control of his North Side empire to the encroaching Italian syndicates. He was reduced to executing petty small-time bank robberies in small Midwestern towns. He was eventually caught and sentenced to a heavy federal term. He died slowly and painfully of terminal lung cancer in the Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary Hospital ward in 1957. When the federal guards officially inventoried his personal belongings upon his death, they found exactly $100 in his prison account, which is barely $1,000 today. An absolute king of the underworld dead, with nothing to show for a lifetime of extreme violence. The SMC Cartage Company garage stood on Clark Street for decades, serving as a grim tourist attraction until it was finally demolished in 1967. The heavy brick wall, deeply pockmarked by the 70 rounds of Thompson fire and stained heavily with the blood of Dr. Schwimmer, was carefully dismantled. The bricks were sold off individually to morbid collectors, eventually ending up displayed in the men's restrooms of various mob-themed bars across the country. From the polished wood bowling lanes and bullet-riddled garages of Chicago, the syndicate model of brute force and territorial control moved steadily eastward, eventually finding a very different, highly racially charged battleground in the Turge. Densely packed, sweltering neighborhood blocks of Upper Manhattan. The heavy smoke from the Chicago bowling alleys and the pockmarked brick walls of the Midwestern garages eventually faded into the rearview mirror, but the syndicate model of extreme territorial violence simply caught a train eastward. It found a very different, highly concentrated battleground on the densely packed, sweltering asphalt grid of Upper Manhattan. In the 1930s, the neighborhood of Harlem was a massive, vibrating ecosystem completely separated from the wealthy high-rises of downtown. It was a place of extreme cultural explosion, intense poverty, and a deeply entrenched underground economy built entirely on the pennies of the desperate working class. The rigid structure of the Italian bootlegging empires meant absolutely nothing above 110th Street. Harlem operated on its own distinct financial engine, a vast illegal lottery system known simply as the numbers game or the policy bank. To understand the sheer scale of the blood spilled on these specific concrete blocks, you have to understand the absolute mathematics of the policy bank. It was essentially a poor man's stock market. A player would choose 3 digits, anywhere from 000 to 999. They could place a bet for as little as a single penny, handing their wager and their chosen numbers to a local runner stationed on a street corner inside a barber shop or behind the counter of a local diner. The winning 3-digit number for the day was not drawn from a hat. It was derived from a highly public, completely random daily statistic printed in the afternoon newspapers, usually the total daily handle of the Cincinnati Clearinghouse or the total payout of a specific racetrack. This made the game completely immune to internal rigging, which created a massive level of absolute trust among the local players. I usually just pull these files and read the ledgers without stopping to do the math, but looking at the sheer financial volume of the Harlem numbers game is absolutely staggering. The odds of a player hitting the correct 3 digits were exactly 1,000 to 1. But the policy bank only paid out at a rate of 600 to 1. That massive 400-point mathematical edge guaranteed the bankers a constant, completely uninterrupted river of raw cash. By 1930, the collective policy banks in Harlem were generating upwards of $20 million a year in gross revenue. That sits right around $450 million in today's money. This massive fortune was built entirely from the nickels, dimes, and pennies of local maids, street sweepers, and factory workers hoping for a tiny sliver of financial relief. The absolute undisputed queen of this massive underground economy was a fiercely independent woman named Madame Stephanie St. Clair. She was a highly educated immigrant from the Caribbean who operated the largest single policy bank in the neighborhood. She dressed in immaculate fur coats, lived in a luxurious apartment on Sugar Hill, and aggressively refused to pay a single dime of protection money to the corrupt local precinct captains or the encroaching white mobsters downtown. She was completely ruthless, highly intelligent, and deeply aware that maintaining control of an empire built on street corners required a heavy, unblinking capacity for sudden violence. To handle the physical enforcement of her borders, she reached out and pulled a man from the deep shadows of the local underworld. His birth name was Ellsworth Raymond Johnson. Ellsworth was born in 1905 in the coastal city of Charleston, South Carolina. He was a highly intelligent, deeply observant child, but he possessed an incredibly short, explosive temper that terrified his own parents. When local white men insulted his family, Ellsworth did not lower his eyes. He picked up heavy rocks and hurled them directly at their heads, fearing he would eventually be lynched by angry mobs in the segregated South. His parents packed him onto a crowded northbound train and sent him to live with his older sister in Harlem. He was a physically imposing teenager sporting a thick, heavily muscled neck that featured a distinct, prominent physical bump on the back. The neighborhood kids quickly gave him a moniker based on that physical trait. He absolutely despised the nickname, viewing it as a massive insult to his intelligence, but the streets do not care about personal preference. The name Bumpy stuck to him like cheap tar. Bumpy Johnson was a massive walking contradiction. He was highly literate, spending hours in the local public libraries, absorbing heavy volumes of philosophy, history, and classical literature. He wrote poetry that was actually published in local neighborhood magazines. He was a brilliant chess player who could anticipate an opponent's move 10 steps in advance. But paradise never lasts forever, and a sharp mind does not stop a bullet. The very same hands that carefully moved carved wooden chess pieces across a board were routinely used to slide a heavily sharpened straight razor directly across the throats of rival gang members. He was not a romantic defender of his community. He was an apex predator who simply preferred to hunt in his own backyard. By his mid-20s, he had already served severe hard time in both the Dannemora and Sing Sing maximum security prisons for armed robbery and extortion. When Madame Street, Claire, made him her chief enforcer, Bumpy accepted the position and immediately began organizing the local street runners into a heavily armed, highly disciplined local militia. They needed that militia because the massive river of pennies flowing through Harlem had attracted the attention of a man who represented everything Bumpy Johnson fundamentally despised. His real name was Arthur Flagenheimer, but the newspapers and the local plod knew him entirely as Dutch Schultz. Schultz was a massive Bronx beer baron who had built a massive multi-million-dollar fortune during Prohibition by using extreme, unhinged violence to control the local taverns. He was our primary shadow nemesis in this ledger, and he was completely and utterly detestable. Despite being worth tens of millions of dollars, Schultz was notoriously cheap. He wore incredibly cheap, poorly fitted suits that constantly smelled of stale cigar smoke and old sweat. He paid his own loyal gunmen absolute garbage wages. He possessed the refined palate of a starving rat, preferring cheap diner food and flat beer to expensive steaks. When the federal government finally repealed Prohibition in 1933, the massive rivers of illegal alcohol money dried up almost instantly. Schultz needed a massive new revenue stream to maintain his sprawling criminal syndicate. He looked straight up the map to the Harlem policy banks and simply decided he was going to take the entire $20 million industry by brute force. He did not attempt to negotiate a peaceful merger. He did not offer to buy out the local bankers. He simply dispatched heavily armed crews of Irish and Italian thugs directly into Harlem with explicit orders to smash the policy banks into splinters. The ensuing conflict was not a glamorous chess match between two brilliant criminal masterminds. It was a filthy, brutal, highly destructive street war that completely terrorized the local civilian population. Schultz utilized his massive financial reserves to directly bribe heavily corrupt magistrates and local police captains. He effectively purchased the local law enforcement apparatus, turning the police into his own private security firm. Uniformed officers began kicking in the doors of St. Claire's counting rooms, arresting her loyal runners, confiscating massive burlap sacks full of betting slips and raw cash, and directly handing the seized territory straight over to Schultz's heavily armed enforcers. The local thugs working for the Bronx Baron did not respect the delicate social ecosystem of the neighborhood. They routinely dragged independent policy bankers into dark, garbage-filled alleyways and aggressively fractured their hands with heavy lead pipes. They smashed the large plate glass windows of local diners that refused to exclusively host Schultz's betting slips. And as always happens when massive criminal syndicates clash over raw geography, the heaviest price was paid entirely by people who had absolutely nothing to do with the conflict. We must open the specific file on a man named James Coates to fully understand the truest, ugliest cost of this war. Coates was a 62-year-old street sweeper. He worked 14-hour shifts, pushing heavy bristled brooms across the filthy cobblestones for the city sanitation department. He had absolutely zero criminal record. He did not drink heavily. He did not carry a weapon. And his only minor vice in the entire world was placing a daily 10-cent wager on the numbers game, hoping to eventually hit a $600 payout to buy his young granddaughter a heavy winter coat and a pair of sturdy leather boots. 10 cents is roughly $2.20 today, a completely insignificant sum to a man like Dutch Schultz. On the sweltering afternoon of August the 14th, 1934, Coates was simply standing on the crowded sidewalk near the corner of Lenox Avenue and 135th Street, holding his small paper betting slip, waiting to hand it to a local runner outside a busy newsstand. He never saw the heavy dark sedan turning the corner at high speed. A crew of Schultz's gunmen ordered to aggressively eliminate any independent runners operating on that specific block, leaned heavily out of the moving windows, carrying heavy Thompson submachine guns and pump-action shotguns. They did not care about the crowded sidewalk. They did not care about the heavy pedestrian traffic. They opened fire indiscriminately into the crowded street. The intended target, a fast-moving young runner working directly for Bumpy Johnson, quickly dove behind a heavy cast-iron fire hydrant and survived with only minor cuts from flying concrete. James Coates was not fast. He was 62 years old and exhausted from his shift. A massive volley of heavy double-aught buckshot tore violently through the wooden newsstand, completely shredding the thick stacks of afternoon papers. 3 heavy lead pellets struck Coates directly in the side of his neck and his upper chest. He collapsed heavily onto the burning hot asphalt, his push broom clattering loudly into the filthy gutter. The dark sedan sped away down the avenue, leaving a massive cloud of blue exhaust smoke and a screaming crowd of terrified civilians. James Coates bled to death on the rough street in less than 4 minutes, his rough, calloused fingers still tightly clutching the worthless 10-cent betting slip. A man who spent his entire life cleaning the city streets was treated entirely like disposable garbage by men fighting over a mountain of pennies. The absolute sheer brutality of these drive-by shootings deeply infuriated Bumpy Johnson. He knew he could not defeat Dutch Schultz in a traditional, highly publicized gang war. Schultz had too many guns, too much raw capital, and the entire local police precinct sitting firmly in his deep pockets. So the poetry-reading intellectual simply decided to utilize massive, highly targeted guerrilla warfare. Bumpy stopped trying to defend the fixed policy banks and took the war directly to Schultz's supply lines. He organized small, highly mobile hit squads equipped entirely with heavily sharpened straight razors and short-barreled revolvers. They waited in the deep shadows of the elevated train tracks and the narrow service alleys behind Schultz's newly acquired counting rooms. When Schultz's heavily armed collection men stepped out to transport the daily cash receipts Bumpy's men struck with extreme terrifying speed, they did not engage in long, drawn-out gunfights. They simply stepped out of the shadows, aggressively grabbed the bagmen from behind, and drove the heavy steel razors deeply across their throats, leaving them bleeding heavily into the dirty snow before vanishing back into the local neighborhood maze with the massive canvas bags of stolen cash. Bumpy intentionally kidnapped Schultz's most experienced jug markers and mathematical accountants, dragging them into deep basements and heavily beating them until they explicitly agreed to abandon the Bronx Baron and worked directly for the local Harlem banks. This relentless, highly aggressive guerrilla campaign slowly bled Schultz's massive operation entirely dry. The Bronx Baron began losing hundreds of thousands of dollars in stolen cash and severely damaged infrastructure. And as the financial losses aggressively mounted, the notoriously unstable Dutch Schultz began to completely lose his grip on reality. He became intensely paranoid, constantly screaming at his own loyal lieutenants, accusing them of stealing from him. But his absolute breaking point was not caused by Bumpy Johnson. It was caused by a highly ambitious, fiercely aggressive special prosecutor named Thomas E. Dewey. Dewey had built his entire political career on dismantling organized crime, and he set his sights directly on Schultz's massive, highly complicated tax evasion schemes. The federal indictments were rapidly closing in, threatening to send Schultz to a cold concrete cell in Dannemora for the rest of his natural life. Cornered bleeding cash in Harlem and facing severe federal time, Schultz made a completely fatal, incredibly stupid calculation. He requested a formal sit-down with the highest authority in the American underworld. He demanded a meeting with the commission. The commission was a highly secretive, tightly organized board of directors that governed the entire national syndicate, led by powerful calculating figures like Charles Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky. These men treated organized crime like a massive, highly efficient corporate entity. They despised loud headlines and completely abhorred unnecessary violence that drew the attention of the federal government. Schultz stood before the heavy oak table in a smoke-filled hotel room and aggressively demanded permission to assassinate Thomas Dewey. He wanted to gun down a high-profile federal prosecutor in the middle of a massive city. Luciano and Lansky stared at him in complete, absolute disbelief. Killing a prosecutor would bring the full, unmitigated wrath of the entire United States government crashing heavily down on every single illicit operation in the entire country. They flatly and completely denied the request, explicitly ordering Schultz to back down stand trial and quietly serve his time. Schultz flew into a massive screaming rage. He violently threw his cheap fedora onto the floor, cursed the entire commission, and stormed out of the room, vowing loudly to kill Dewey himself within 48 hours. By doing so, he signed his own absolute death warrant. The commission immediately authorized a highly lucrative, completely open contract on the life of Arthur Fliegenheimer. They reached out to Murder Incorporated, the heavily specialized enforcement arm operating out of Brooklyn, and handed the massive file directly to two of their most efficient, cold-blooded killers, Charles the Bug Workman and Emmanuel Mendy. Vice, which brings us to the exact geographic coordinates of the final climax. The Palace Chop House at 12 East Park Street in Newark, New Jersey. It was the evening of October the 23rd, 1935. The heavy air inside the restaurant smelled strongly of roasted beef, heavy garlic, and stale draft beer. Schultz was using the back room of the tavern as a temporary, heavily concealed headquarters to avoid the aggressive New York police departments. At exactly 10:15 at night, Schultz sat heavily at a large round wooden table covered entirely in thick accounting ledgers, adding machine tapes and stacks of raw cash. He was completely surrounded by his most loyal, heavily armed lieutenants. Abe Landau, his chief enforcer, Bernard Rosenkrantz, his massive, heavily muscled bodyguard, and Otto Berman, a brilliant, highly specialized mathematical genius who manipulated the racing odds for the massive syndicate. Schultz pushed his heavy chair back from the wooden table, stood up, and walked slowly toward the men's restroom located in the back corner of the restaurant. He was completely unarmed, wearing his usual terribly fitted suit. Just moments after the heavy wooden bathroom door swung shut, the front entrance of the Palace Chop House burst violently open. Charles Workman and Mendy Weiss stepped into the dim light. They were wearing heavy dark overcoats and carrying fully loaded .38 caliber revolvers and a massive heavy 12-gauge pump-action shotgun. They did not shout a warning. They did not order the terrified civilian patrons to hit the floor. Workman walked briskly and purposefully straight past the bar directly toward the back room. He stepped firmly into the restroom. Schultz was standing closely at the porcelain urinal, washing his hands, entirely, completely oblivious to the massive threat standing right behind him. Workman raised his heavy revolver. He was carrying deeply customized ammunition. The heavy .45 caliber slugs had been intentionally coated in raw, infectious iron rust to absolutely ensure that if the initial gunshot did not kill the target instantly, massive bacterial infection would finish the job slowly and painfully. Workman fired a single deafening round. The rusty slug struck Schultz just below his heavy ribs on the left side, tearing violently through his stomach, shredding his large intestine and completely shattering his gallbladder before exiting his lower back and ricocheting loudly off the white porcelain tiles. Schultz gasped heavily and collapsed onto the filthy urine-soaked floor tiles, clutching his bleeding abdomen in extreme agony. Workman immediately stepped backward out of the restroom and joined Weiss in the main dining area, opening massive sustained fire on the three men sitting at the wooden table. The violence was incredibly brief and absolutely devastating. Abe Landau was struck repeatedly in the heavy chest, his blood spraying violently across the massive accounting ledgers. Bernard Rosenkrantz attempted to draw his heavy weapon, but was hit multiple times, collapsing heavily against the thick wooden paneling. The mathematical genius Otto Berman took a massive blast from the heavy shotgun directly to the side of his head, his brilliant numbers, obsessed brain, practically painting the heavy oak wall behind him. The two assassins then quickly turned around, walked calmly out the front door, climbed into a waiting getaway car, and vanished entirely into the dark New Jersey night. Inside the heavy smoke of the chop house, the scene was a complete, shattered slaughterhouse. But Dutch Schultz was not completely dead. He managed to drag his heavily bleeding body out of the bathroom, stumbling blindly into the dining room, clutching his massive stomach wound before collapsing heavily into a wooden chair. He was quickly loaded into a screaming ambulance and rushed directly to the Newark City Hospital. The heavy rust-coated bullet had done exactly what the assassins designed it to do. As Schultz lay tightly strapped to a sterile metal hospital bed, massive peritonitis aggressively set in. His internal organs were completely ruptured, leaking heavy stomach acid and massive bacteria directly into his bloodstream. The infection caused his internal body temperature to spike violently, boiling his blood and sending him into a severe, highly intense state of absolute delirium. The local police department immediately placed a highly trained stenographer directly beside his bed, hoping the dying mobster would accidentally reveal the location of his massive hidden fortunes or explicitly name his killers. For 24 straight hours, Arthur Fliegenheimer babbled incessantly into the sterile air. He spoke in completely fractured, surreal poetry, jumping wildly from childhood memories to accounting ledgers to massive paranoid delusions. The stenographer frantically wrote down every single nonsensical phrase. He screamed about the police, he mumbled about broken windows, and he muttered completely strange, disconnected phrases, like a boy has never wept nor dashed 1,000 Kim. The room smelled heavily of iodine bleach and rotting internal tissue. The powerful millionaire was reduced to a sweating, heavily restrained animal, completely unable to control his own broken mind. As the deep infection finally reached his damaged heart on the evening of October the 24th, 1935, Schultz stared blankly up at the cracked plaster ceiling of the hospital room. He drew a heavily rattled, shallow breath and uttered his final, completely incomprehensible words to the silent stenographer. "Mother is the best bet, and don't let Satan draw you too fast." He completely stopped breathing 2 minutes later. The immediate aftermath of the bloody war left massive, permanent scars across the entire map. Schultz's massive, heavily rumored personal fortune, supposedly roughly $7 million in cash and bearer bonds, which is over $150 million today, was allegedly buried in a heavy iron lockbox somewhere deep in the Sang Catskill Mountains. Despite tens of thousands of people aggressively digging up the forests over the last 80 years, not a single heavily rusted dime has ever been recovered. His entire empire completely evaporated the exact second his heart stopped. Madame Stephanie St. Clair, reading the bloody headlines in the safety of her Sugar Hill apartment, sent a completely cold, highly vindictive telegram directly to the hospital shortly before Schultz died. The printed paper simply read, "As ye sow, so shall ye reap." She eventually retired quietly from the numbers game, living a completely comfortable life until she passed away in 1969. As for Bumpy Johnson, the intellectual enforcer who fought a massive bloody street war to protect the borders of Harlem, his absolute victory was incredibly hollow. With Schultz completely removed from the heavy board, the Italian commission simply stepped right into the massive vacuum. Lucky Luciano arranged a private, highly structured sit-down with Bumpy. The rules of the new arrangement were explicitly clear. Bumpy would be officially recognized as the absolute uncrowned king of Harlem. He would completely control the massive local policy banks and the heavily armed enforcers. But he would explicitly answer directly to the Italian syndicate, and he would hand over a massive, non-negotiable percentage of the daily profits directly to downtown. Bumpy agreed. He fought a vicious, incredibly destructive war that cost the lives of innocent sweepers like James Coates, only to successfully trade one massive white boss for a highly organized syndicate of them. He became a very wealthy, highly feared middleman, ensuring the massive rivers of pennies continued to flow directly out of the neighborhood and into the heavy bank accounts of men who never even stepped foot above 110th Street. He survived the war of the policy banks, but as the decades slowly ground forward, a completely new, infinitely more destructive poison would be introduced into the very bloodstream of his neighborhood, forcing the aging kingpin to fight a war he could not possibly win. The San Francisco Bay was a swirling, freezing expanse of black water and jagged currents in the winter of 1952. The salt spray whipped violently against the heavy steel transport boat as it slowly approached the imposing rocky shores of Alcatraz Island. Inside the heavily guarded hold sat Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. The uncrowned king of Harlem was thousands of miles away from the neon lights of the Apollo Theater and the crowded, sweltering pavement of Lenox Avenue. He was 46 years old, wearing a cheap, heavily starched federal prison uniform, staring at a 15-year sentence for conspiracy to sell heroin. He had built a massive criminal empire by orchestrating bloody street wars with straight razors and shotguns, but he was ultimately brought down by the very system he thought he could outsmart. Alcatraz was not a rehabilitation center. It was a massive, silent tomb constructed entirely of unyielding concrete and highly reinforced steel bars. Bumpy was placed in a tiny 5-by-9-foot cell in D Block. The air smelled permanently of industrial bleach, damp concrete, and the freezing salt fog that rolled in off the bay. He spent his days in strict enforced silence, reading heavy volumes of philosophy and playing highly complex games of chess against the cold iron bars. He was a deeply intelligent, highly literate man who had intentionally chosen the path of extreme violence. But while he sat isolated on the rock, carefully moving imaginary pawns in his head, the world outside was violently shifting beneath his feet. The highly organized Italian syndicates he had partnered with were rapidly changing their business model. The heavy canvas bags full of pennies and nickels from the Harlem policy banks were no longer the primary engine of the national underworld. The commission had discovered a significantly more efficient, infinitely more destructive revenue stream. It was known quietly as the French Connection. The massive logistics of this operation are absolutely staggering to review in the historical ledgers. Raw opium was aggressively harvested in the rural, sun-baked fields of Turkey. It was then shipped clandestinely across the Mediterranean Sea to the heavily controlled port city of Marseille, France, where highly skilled underground chemists processed the dark paste into incredibly pure, bright white heroin. I usually keep completely neutral when pulling these old files, but the absolute sheer naked greed of the men who orchestrated this massive pipeline is completely nauseating. The profit margins were astronomically high, completely dwarfing the illegal alcohol trade of the Prohibition era. A single, tightly packed kilogram of pure heroin could be purchased in Marseille for roughly $4,000, which is approximately $46,000 in today's currency. By the time that same kilogram was smuggled onto the bustling docks of New York City, heavily diluted with baking powder and quinine by local street crews, and packaged into thousands of tiny glassine envelopes, it generated a gross street value of over $300,000. Roughly $3.5 million today. It was an absolute river of untraceable wealth, and the Italian crime families intended to flood the densely populated, highly vulnerable neighborhoods of Upper Manhattan with this new product. The man primarily responsible for overseeing the aggressive distribution of this poison into Bumpy Johnson's territory was a rising enforcer in the Genovese crime family named Vincent Gigante. Gigante is our primary shadow nemesis in this specific ledger, and he was the absolute antithesis of Bumpy's intellectual, well-read persona. Gigante was a former professional light heavyweight boxer who realized early on that taking brutal punches to the head for a few $100s was a complete waste of time when he could simply take what he wanted with a loaded .38 caliber revolver. But Gigante possessed a completely different, highly manipulative kind of brilliance. He knew the federal government was rapidly expanding its wiretapping operations and aggressively targeting the high-ranking members of the Mafia. So, Gigante constructed a massive, incredibly elaborate public illusion. He intentionally stopped bathing regularly. He began wandering aimlessly through the busy streets of Greenwich Village in the middle of the day, wearing heavily stained, cheap bathrobes and worn-out slippers. He would intentionally stop on crowded street corners, stare blankly at the brick walls, and aggressively mutter completely incoherent rambling sentences to invisible people. The local residents and the beat cops completely dismissed him as a harmless, severely mentally ill local character. They called him the Chin. But behind the dirty bathrobe and the fake, deeply pathetic shuffling walk, Gigante was entirely lucid. He was a stone-cold, highly calculating apex predator, quietly pulling the strings of a massive narcotics empire that was actively destroying tens of thousands of lives in Harlem. He completely avoided federal prison for decades simply by playing the fool while heavily taxing the very people he deemed beneath him. In 1963, after serving more than a decade in federal custody, Bumpy Johnson was officially released from Alcatraz and took a train back to New York. His highly anticipated return to Harlem was covered extensively by the local press. The community threw massive impromptu parades in the streets. Local politicians and deeply corrupt police captains lined up in dark back rooms to shake his hand and pay their respects. They viewed him as a massive returning hero, the legendary Godfather, who had fiercely protected the neighborhood from the brutal incursions of men like Dutch Schultz decades earlier. It was a beautiful, highly romanticized image of a king returning to his loyal subjects. But paradise never lasts forever, and a heavy crown does not stop the devastating reality of the streets. When Bumpy finally stepped out of the expensive, highly polished black Cadillacs and actually looked at the neighborhood he claimed to love, he did not find a thriving community. He found a completely devastated, hollowed-out wasteland. The massive influx of Italian-controlled heroin had completely eroded the fundamental foundation of Harlem. We must pause the timeline right here to open a highly specific, deeply tragic file on a young man named Frankie Lyman. Frankie was not an anonymous face in the crowd. In the late 1950s, he was a massive, highly successful teenage music star, the lead singer of a group that produced massive national hit records. He had a brilliant voice, a massive fortune, and the absolute world at his feet. But the sheer availability of the glassine envelopes on the streets of his own neighborhood was a massive, highly aggressive undertow. Frankie did not know that the bright white powder he purchased began its long, bloody journey in a sun-baked poppy field in Turkey. He only knew that it silenced the heavy pressure of his fading fame. The physical addiction moved with an aggressive, relentless speed. Within a few short years, Frankie completely lost his recording contracts, his massive fortune, and his own voice. He resorted to petty theft and forging checks just to secure his next hit. On the freezing morning of February the 27th, 1968, at the age of 25, Frankie was found completely motionless on the filthy floor of his grandmother's bathroom on 164th Street. A cheap, heavily rusted syringe was lying directly next to his body. He had died entirely alone, his brilliant musical mind completely extinguished by an overdose of highly pure heroin. He was not killed in a glamorous gangland shootout. He was simply swept away like garbage by the massive, highly organized corporate machinery of the underworld. Frankie Lyman was just one highly visible name in a massive ledger of thousands of young victims who were sacrificed to generate millions of dollars for men walking around in bathrobes downtown. This extreme, devastating reality completely strips away the highly romanticized myth of Bumpy Johnson. The movies portray him as a noble, deeply conflicted anti-hero who aggressively fought the Italian Mafia to keep drugs out of his neighborhood. The cold, unredacted historical facts tell a completely different, deeply damning story. Bumpy Johnson was not fighting a moral crusade against narcotics. He was fighting a highly aggressive, deeply violent turf war, strictly over the massive profit margins of the distribution networks. He deeply resented the fact that the Genovese family men like Vincent Gigante were directly controlling the primary supply lines and dictating the wholesale prices. Bumpy wanted complete, absolute control over the massive river of cash flowing from the veins of his own people. He actively organized heavy boycotts against local Italian-owned businesses and ordered his enforcers to aggressively hijack Italian drug shipments, not to destroy the product, but to simply resell it himself and keep the massive profits within his own organization. He was a highly intelligent, well-read poet who willingly built his massive personal fortune on the broken, suffocating bodies of young men like Frankie Lyman. He claimed to protect Harlem, but he was actively, knowingly charging a heavy toll on the exact poison that was killing it. By 1968, the sheer physical and mental stress of attempting to forcefully reclaim a rapidly crumbling empire had taken a massive toll on the aging kingpin. He was 62 years old. His once imposing, heavily muscled frame had shrunk significantly. He suffered from severe, highly painful congestive heart failure. His daily life was a massive, deeply paranoid cycle of attempting to avoid the relentless surveillance of the federal government. The FBI had permanently stationed highly trained agents in heavily unmarked vehicles directly outside his apartment building. They tapped his personal phone lines and heavily pressured his closest associates to flip and testify against him. In a desperate, highly erratic move, Bumpy attempted to stage a massive sit-in protest at a local police precinct, falsely claiming he was the victim of racially motivated police harassment. It was a completely transparent, deeply cynical attempt to use the highly charged civil rights movement of the late 60s as a personal shield for his massive illegal rackets. The federal prosecutors were absolutely entirely unmoved by the theatrical display. They quietly handed down a massive, highly detailed federal indictment against him, charging him as the absolute central figure in a massive multi-million-dollar narcotics conspiracy. He was arrested heavily, fingerprinted, and released on a $50,000 bail bond, which equates to roughly $450,000 today. Bumpy knew the heavy, unyielding concrete walls of Alcatraz were rapidly closing in on him once again, and he knew his failing, deeply damaged heart would not survive another 15-year sentence in the freezing fog of the Bay. Which brings us to the exact geographic coordinates of his final moments. The early morning hours of July the 7th, 1968, the heavy, suffocating summer heat hung tightly over the cracked pavement of Harlem. Bumpy Johnson was sitting at a small, crowded table inside Wells Restaurant on Lenox Avenue. It was a famous, highly popular late-night spot heavily known for its chicken and waffles. The restaurant was brightly lit, smelling deeply of heavy frying oil and strong, bitter coffee. He was surrounded by a small group of his closest, heavily armed childhood friends. There was no massive, highly orchestrated assassination attempt. No heavily armed hitmen stepped through the glass front doors with heavy Thompson submachine guns. The brutal, violent life he had led finally caught up with his own internal biology. At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, while eating a heavy plate of fried chicken and drinking a hot cup of black coffee, Bumpy suddenly stopped chewing. A massive, catastrophic myocardial infarction struck his damaged heart. The absolute sheer agony tore violently through his chest and radiated heavily down his left arm. He violently dropped his metal fork, the heavy utensil clattering loudly against the ceramic plate. He reached up with both hands, aggressively clutching his chest, his eyes wide with sudden, absolute shock. He looked directly across the small table at his childhood friend, a man named Junie Bird. Bumpy drew a heavy, incredibly ragged breath, his face turning completely pale in the bright fluorescent light. He uttered his final completely pathetic words on this earth. "I am going down." He collapsed heavily, face forward his head, slamming aggressively onto the small wooden table, completely scattering his unfinished meal onto the linoleum floor. His heavily armed associates frantically grabbed his lifeless body, dragged him out to a waiting vehicle, and rushed him directly to Harlem Hospital. But the massive heart attack was absolute. The medical staff officially pronounced Ellsworth Raymond Johnson completely dead shortly before 3 in the morning. A man who had survived decades of highly violent gang wars, heavy straight razors, and deep federal prisons was completely extinguished by a piece of fried chicken and a severely failing organ. The immediate aftermath of his sudden death left a massive, heavily contested power vacuum in the underworld. His highly lucrative criminal empire did not survive him. The aggressive Italian syndicates, led by men like Vincent Gigante, immediately swept in and completely seized control of the highly profitable Harlem narcotics trade, completely subjugating the local crews without firing a single shot. Gigante continued his massive, highly elaborate fake insanity act for decades, successfully avoiding heavy federal prison time while quietly ordering the brutal murders of dozens of men. He lived a highly comfortable, deeply insulated life until the federal government finally managed to completely break his massive deception in the late 1990s. Gigante was eventually convicted and died as a completely broken, highly pathetic old man in a highly secured federal prison hospital in 2005. The massive FBI file on Bumpy Johnson, containing tens of thousands of heavily detailed pages regarding his extensive criminal enterprises, remains heavily redacted and partially classified to this very day. The highly romanticized movies and television shows will continue to portray him as a brilliant, deeply principled Robin Hood of the streets. But the cold, unyielding archives tell the absolute truth. He was a highly intelligent man who intentionally chose to weaponize his massive intellect to exploit the most vulnerable members of his own community. He fought a vicious, highly destructive war against the Italian Mafia, not to stop the flow of deadly poison into Harlem, but simply to secure a larger, heavier cut of the blood money for himself. He died, completely broke, heavily indicted, and entirely unable to protect his own neighborhood from the massive tidal wave of addiction that followed his reign. From the sweltering, heavily devastated streets of Upper Manhattan, the massive syndicates continued to expand their violent influence, but they eventually encountered a completely different breed of criminal. One who did not care about massive corporate ledgers, territorial boundaries, or the heavy rules of the Italian Commission. A deeply unstable, highly dangerous individual who decided that the only way to truly make a name in the underworld was to completely declare open war against the entire system itself. The suffocating heavy heat of the Harlem policy wars eventually cooled into a highly regulated, deeply taxed corporate system controlled entirely by the Italian syndicates stationed downtown. But while the highly calculated bosses of the commission were busy counting their massive new heroin profits in heavily guarded social clubs, a completely different breed of violence was aggressively festering in the deep shadows of the fire. Brooklyn waterfront. The rigid, tightly controlled structure of the National Crime Syndicate relied entirely on absolute obedience and strict adherence to a deeply entrenched hierarchy. They demanded that soldiers follow orders without question, collect their meager envelopes, and keep their mouths firmly shut. They completely failed to account for a deeply unstable, highly dangerous individual who decided that the only way to truly secure a massive legacy in the underworld was to completely declare open bloody war against the very men who printed the paychecks. The waterfront neighborhood of Red Hook, Brooklyn in the 1930s and 40s was a massive, vibrating labyrinth of heavy industry. The air constantly tasted heavily of diesel exhaust, rusting ship hulls, and the sharp, freezing salt spray coming directly off the East River. It was a brutally unforgiving environment where newly arrived Italian immigrants broke their backs unloading massive cargo freighters for absolute pennies. Survival on the cobblestone streets of Red Hook required extreme physical toughness and a complete willingness to inflict sudden, devastating violence over minor perceived insults. Umberto Joseph Gallo was born directly into this industrial meat grinder in 1929. His father was a highly successful, heavily armed bootlegger during the Prohibition era, meaning the three Gallo brothers, Larry, Albert, and Joe, were raised in a household where loaded revolvers were left casually on the kitchen table, alongside the heavy plates of pasta, from a very early age. It was explicitly clear to everyone in the neighborhood that there was something deeply and fundamentally wrong with Joe's internal wiring. He possessed a highly erratic, completely explosive temper that terrified his own siblings. After a series of highly violent teenage arrests for burglary and severe assault, a judge ordered a full psychiatric evaluation at the Kings County Hospital. The state psychiatrists observed him closely and officially diagnosed him with severe paranoid schizophrenia. They recommended immediate, heavily supervised institutionalization. His parents flatly refused the medical treatment, pulling him out of the hospital and throwing him right back onto the violent streets. This deeply untreated mental instability became the absolute foundation of his entire criminal career. Joe did not want to be a quiet, successful earner. He was completely obsessed with the highly romanticized, deeply fictionalized Hollywood gangster movies of the era. He actively modeled his entire physical persona after the actor Richard Widmark in the movie Kiss of Death, adopting a highly affected, heavily exaggerated swagger. He wore expensive, custom-tailored black suits and heavy, dark sunglasses in the middle of the night. He would routinely quote cheap, dramatically stylized movie dialogue right before aggressively fracturing a local shopkeeper's jaw with a heavy lead pipe. The neighborhood locals quietly referred to him as Crazy Joe, a moniker he actively encouraged because he believed it made him sound utterly terrifying. By the late 1950s, the Gallo brothers had built a highly efficient, deeply violent local crew operating entirely out of a heavily fortified social club on President Street. They worked as primary enforcers and highly specialized contract killers directly under the absolute control of Joe Profaci. Profaci was the undisputed boss of his own Brooklyn crime family, a man who represented everything the younger generation of mobsters completely despised. Profaci was an old-school mustache Pete, a highly conservative boss who had built a massive multi-million-dollar fortune entirely on legitimate olive oil imports and highly illegal extortion rackets. He lived in a massive, heavily guarded estate on Long Island, complete with a private airstrip and a private hunting reserve. Despite his massive personal wealth, Profaci was notoriously aggressively cheap. He forced every single initiated member of his crime family to pay him a mandatory $25 monthly tax, which translates to roughly $330 today, simply for the absolute privilege of working for him. If a soldier missed a single monthly payment, Profaci would order his immediate execution. The Gallo crew deeply resented this extreme taxation. They were doing the heavy, incredibly dangerous physical labor on the streets, shaking down massive local unions and running highly profitable illegal floating dice games, while the aging boss sat safely behind high brick walls and hoarded the vast majority of the raw cash. The absolute breaking point occurred in October of 1957. The commission needed to permanently eliminate Albert Anastasia, the highly feared, incredibly brutal boss of Murder Incorporated. It was an incredibly dangerous, highly sensitive contract. Profaci handed the heavy assignment directly to the Gallo crew, heavily implying they would receive massive territorial concessions and a massive financial payout for successfully handling the massive problem. The Gallo brothers meticulously planned the assassination. They waited until Anastasia was sitting completely relaxed in a heavy leather barber chair at the Park Sheraton Hotel in Manhattan. Two heavily armed gunmen walked into the brightly lit shop, pulled heavy .38 caliber revolvers, and completely emptied the heavy lead cylinders directly into the mirror and the boss's chest, leaving him bleeding out heavily onto the black and white tiled floor. It was a perfectly executed massive shift in underworld power. But when the dust finally settled, Joe Profaci completely reneged on his promises. He divided Anastasia's highly lucrative rackets among his own loyal family members, handing the Gallo crew a completely insulting tiny cash bonus. Joe Gallo was utterly infuriated. But instead of simply plotting a standard bloody revenge assassination, his severely untreated mental illness led him down a completely bizarre, highly delusional path. Joe began spending hours aggressively reading heavy volumes of classic philosophy. He devoured the works of Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, and Niccolò Machiavelli. He began to deeply view himself not as a simple street thug, but as a highly sophisticated, completely brilliant political revolutionary. He convinced himself that he was destined to completely overthrow the ancient, deeply flawed structure of the entire American Mafia. He actively preached to his heavily armed crew that they were leading a massive intellectual rebellion against a corrupt capitalist boss. In February of 1961, Joe executed his grand, highly delusional master plan. The Gallo crew aggressively kidnapped 4 of the highest-ranking members of the Profaci family in a single, highly coordinated, massive sweep. They threw heavy burlap sacks over their heads, shoved them directly into the trunks of stolen sedans, and dragged them to heavily fortified safe houses across the city. Joe demanded massive financial concessions and a complete restructuring of the family hierarchy in exchange for their safe release. But Joe Gallo made a completely fatal, incredibly arrogant calculation. He heavily trusted a man named Carmine Persico. Persico is our primary shadow nemesis in this specific ledger. He was a highly efficient, completely cold-blooded enforcer who had grown up closely with the Gallo brothers. He was completely pragmatic, deeply ambitious, and absolutely immune to Joe's bizarre philosophical rants. Persico was actually one of the men the Gallos had successfully kidnapped. While sitting heavily tied to a wooden chair in a dark basement, Persico quietly negotiated a massive secret deal directly with Joe Profaci. He explicitly promised the old boss that if he was safely released, he would immediately turn around and completely eradicate the entire Gallo rebellion from the inside out. Profaci agreed. The hostages were released. Just weeks later, in August of 1961, Larry Gallo walked into the dimly lit Sahara Lounge in Brooklyn for what he explicitly believed was a highly secretive strategy meeting with his good friend, Carmine Persico. The moment Larry stepped into the heavy shadows near the back bar, Persico and another heavily armed associate violently grabbed him from behind. Persico wrapped a highly customized, heavy steel garrote wire tightly around Larry's throat and began violently twisting the wooden handles, actively attempting to crush the man's windpipe. Larry was heavily turning blue, his lungs completely burning for oxygen, when a completely random, highly fortunate event occurred. A uniformed beat cop simply walked through the front doors of the tavern to escape the heavy summer heat. Persico panicked, dropped the heavy steel wire, and sprinted heavily out the back service door, leaving Larry gasping violently on the filthy floor. The Sahara Lounge betrayal completely ignited the massive, deeply destructive First Colombo War. The streets of Brooklyn became an incredibly active, highly lethal combat zone. The Gallo crew barricaded themselves entirely inside their heavily fortified President Street headquarters, sleeping heavily on dirty cots, surrounded by loaded pump-action shotguns and extremely aggressive guard dogs. But the massive street war was suddenly heavily interrupted by the absolute sheer stupidity of Joe Gallo's massive ego. While actively fighting a massive, highly dangerous mafia war requiring millions of dollars in untraceable cash, Joe decided to personally strong-arm a local Brooklyn cafe owner for a slightly higher percentage of his weekly profits. The owner quietly went straight to the local detectives. Joe was quickly arrested, heavily indicted, and rapidly convicted of simple felony extortion. The judge sentenced the fake philosopher to a maximum of 10 years in state prison. I usually keep my personal observations completely out of these ledgers, but the sheer, absolute arrogance required to start a massive national gang war only to get yourself immediately locked in a concrete cage over a few $100s in a coffee shop completely defies all logical explanation. Joe was processed directly into the heavily guarded walls of Attica Correctional Facility in 1961. And while the prison years usually break the heavy spirit of street-level thugs, the isolation completely amplified Joe's massive delusions of grandeur. He actively refused to associate with the traditional highly segregated Italian mafia inmates. Instead, he heavily recruited massive enforcers from the highly aggressive, heavily populated black inmate population, forming a completely new, heavily integrated crew of loyal soldiers. He spent his days painting terrible watercolor landscapes and reading heavy political theory, completely convincing himself that upon his release, he would violently merge the Italian and black underworlds into a single, massive, unstoppable criminal army. He served exactly 10 years. When the heavy steel gates of Attica finally swung open in early 1971, Joe Gallo stepped out into a completely different, highly transformed underworld. Joe Profesi had died slowly of terminal liver cancer. The family was now firmly under the absolute control of a highly ambitious, deeply charismatic boss named Joe Colombo. Colombo had aggressively formed the Italian-American Civil Rights League, actively organizing massive public rallies in Columbus Circle and heavily drawing the intense, highly unwanted scrutiny of the federal government. Colombo reached out directly to the newly released Gallo, offering him a massive $1,000 peace offering, roughly $7,000 today, to officially bury the hatchet and join the new administration. Joe Gallo stared coldly at the messenger, flatly refused the envelope, and explicitly stated that the peace tax was officially $100,000, roughly $750,000 today, or the massive street war would resume immediately. Just weeks later, while speaking at a massive outdoor rally in Columbus Circle, Joe Colombo was violently shot in the head by a highly disturbed young gunman who was immediately killed by Colombo's heavily armed bodyguards. Colombo survived but was completely paralyzed, trapped inside his own ruined body until his death 7 years later. While the official police ledgers never directly tied Joe Gallo to the massive assassination attempt, the entire underworld actively believed he had ordered it. The heavy contract was permanently placed on his head. But instead of aggressively going to the mattresses and locking himself inside a heavily fortified bunker, Joe Gallo did something utterly, deeply incomprehensible. He aggressively threw himself into the highly publicized, deeply glamorous bohemian lifestyle of the Manhattan elite. He started hanging out constantly in expensive Greenwich Village apartments with famous playwrights, prominent journalists, and wealthy actors like Jerry Orbach. The wealthy elites found his violent past completely fascinating. They treated him exactly like a heavily dangerous, deeply exotic pet. He attended highly exclusive cocktail parties wearing massive, heavy sunglasses, enthusiastically discussing heavy existentialism with people who had absolutely no concept of the extreme, terrifying violence waiting for him right out on the Mask Street. We must firmly pause the timeline right here to open a highly specific, deeply tragic file on the collateral damage of this massive delusion. During this period of heavy socializing, Joe met a woman named Sina Esseri. She was a completely normal, highly attractive dental assistant. She had absolutely zero connections to the criminal underworld. And more importantly, she had a completely innocent 10-year-old daughter named Lisa. Joe Gallo completely charmed the civilian mother. He aggressively pursued her, showering her with expensive dinners and heavy gold jewelry. In early 1972, they were officially married in a massive, highly publicized ceremony. Joe immediately moved Sina and her young daughter directly into his heavily fortified compound on President Street. He completely surrounded a young, completely innocent child with heavily armed hitmen, massive stashes of illegal narcotics, and a highly dangerous, totally unregulated pet lion cub that he actively kept chained to a heavy iron radiator in the living room. He brought a civilian family directly into an active, highly lethal war zone, showing absolutely zero regard for their physical safety. He simply viewed them as heavy, expensive props in his massive theatrical delusion of being a legitimate, highly cultured family man. Which brings us directly to the exact geographic coordinates of the final climax. April the 6th, 1972. It was Joe Gallo's 43rd birthday. He spent the early evening enjoying a massive, highly expensive dinner at the Copacabana nightclub, watching the comedian Don Rickles perform from a heavily reserved front row table. He was surrounded by his new bride Sina, her 10-year-old daughter Lisa, his heavily armed bodyguard Pete Diapoulis, and his sister. At exactly 4 o'clock in the morning on April the 7th, the massive entourage left the club. Joe suddenly decided he desperately wanted a heavy plate of fresh seafood. They drove two massive luxury vehicles directly down into the deep, highly traditional heart of Little Italy. They parked outside Umberto's clam house at 129 Mulberry Street. It was an incredibly brazen, highly stupid move. Little Italy was the absolute heavily guarded fortress of the rival crime families. It was essentially walking completely unarmed directly into a heavy enemy encampment. The restaurant was brightly lit and completely empty, except for a few straggling late-night tourists. The massive Gallo party sat at a heavy wooden table located directly in the back left corner of the narrow dining room. Joe sat with his back, completely exposed to the large glass front doors, a massive, highly amateur mistake for a man who actively knew a heavy contract was on his head. He ordered massive plates of scungilly heavy fried calamari and cheap red wine. Across the street, a low-level mob spotter noticed the massive entourage walk inside. He immediately ran to a corner payphone and dialed a highly specific number. Within 15 minutes, a heavily armed hit squad acting on direct orders from the Colombo family leadership arrived on the completely deserted street. At exactly 4:30 in the morning, the front glass doors of Umberto's clam house swung violently open. Four men wearing heavy dark coats stepped firmly into the brightly lit restaurant. They completely bypassed the long wooden bar. They did not shout a heavy warning. They drew heavy .32 and .38 caliber revolvers and immediately opened massive sustained fire directly toward the back corner table. The absolute deafening roar of the heavy weapons completely shattered the quiet dining room. The heavy air instantly filled with the sharp, acidic smell of burnt gunpowder, shattered safety glass, and heavy marinara sauce. The crossfire was completely chaotic. Pete Diapoulos, the highly trained bodyguard, desperately attempted to draw his heavy weapon, but was immediately struck directly in the hip by a heavy lead round, collapsing completely onto the tiled floor. Sina Essery screamed violently, grabbing her 10-year-old daughter and aggressively dragging her completely under the heavy wooden table, frantically trying to shield the child from the massive wall of flying lead. Joe Gallo was hit almost immediately. A heavy .38 caliber slug tore violently through his heavy shoulder, spinning his body aggressively around. A second heavy round struck him directly in the upper back. The sheer physical impact knocked him completely out of his wooden chair. He crashed heavily onto the floor, but he did not stay down. Bleeding heavily from multiple massive wounds, Joe scrambled to his feet. He aggressively flipped the heavy wooden dining table entirely, oversending massive ceramic plates of seafood and heavy wine glasses, shattering loudly against the walls. Whether he was actively attempting to draw the heavy gunfire completely away from his newly acquired civilian family, or simply aggressively panicking and running for his own life, remains heavily debated in the cold archives. But he staggered blindly toward the front entrance of the restaurant, completely unarmed and bleeding heavily. The assassins casually tracked his desperate movements, continuing to fire heavily into his staggering body. A third round completely shattered his left arm. A fourth round tore violently into his heavily muscled chest. Joe stumbled violently through the shattered glass front doors and completely collapsed onto the cold, filthy cobblestones of Hester Street. He left a massive, heavily smeared trail of thick blood directly across the highly polished restaurant floor. He managed to aggressively drag his ruined body a few feet across the dark, completely empty street, attempting to reach his parked vehicle. He made it exactly halfway across the intersection before his damaged heart completely gave out. There were no highly philosophical final words. There was no dramatic poetic speech reflecting on the complex duality of man. He was shot exactly 5 times. He completely collapsed into a massive, rapidly expanding pool of his own blood directly next to a parked car. He died completely mute, face down in the absolute filth of the gutter, a fake intellectual butchered like a completely common street punk. The massive hit squad calmly turned around, walked briskly to a waiting getaway car, and vanished entirely into the early morning darkness before the heavy police sirens even began to wail in the distance. The immediate aftermath of the massive assassination was severely clouded by heavy misinformation. Decades later, a completely highly unreliable mob hitman named Frank Sheeran, famously known as the Irishman, actively claimed to authors that he was the lone, highly efficient assassin who walked into Umberto's that night. It was a massive, completely fabricated lie designed strictly to sell books. The cold, unredacted police ledgers and highly classified FBI wiretaps eventually confirmed that the massive hit was carried out entirely by Colombo. Family loyalists led directly by a vicious enforcer named Carmine DiBiase. Sina Esseri and her young daughter survived the massive crossfire, completely physically unhurt, but they were deeply permanently traumatized by the absolute sheer horror of watching a man butchered directly in front of them. They quickly packed their bags and vanished completely from the Mafia lifestyle, returning strictly to the quiet, highly anonymous civilian world. As for the shadow nemesis Carmine, the Snake Persico, he aggressively won the massive, highly destructive war. He eventually assumed total, absolute control of the entire Colombo crime family. He ruled the massive syndicate with extreme, terrifying violence for decades. But he did not escape the heavy crush of the federal government. Persico was eventually convicted in the massive commission trial of 1986 and sentenced to exactly 139 years in federal custody. He spent the entire rest of his natural life locked inside a highly secured concrete box. He died slowly of massive organ failure at the Federal Medical Center in North Carolina in 2019 at the exact age of 85. He died an absolute king, but a king of a deeply pathetic, heavily monitored cage. Joe Gallo believed he could completely rewrite the ancient, deeply entrenched rules of the underworld by simply quoting French philosophers and hanging out with Broadway actors. But the cold, unyielding archives prove that bullets completely ignore existential theory. From the bloody cobblestones of Little Italy, the massive, highly publicized gang wars eventually shifted completely out to the West Coast, where a completely different breed of criminal attempted to build a massive, glittering empire of extreme violence under the bright, heavily unforgiving sun of Los Angeles. The Southern California sun beat down heavily on the newly laid asphalt of the Sunset Strip in the late 1930s. Los Angeles was actively selling a massive, highly manufactured illusion to the rest of the country. It was heavily marketed as a paradise of citrus groves, crashing ocean waves, and the absolute glittering excess of the motion picture industry. But underneath the expensive studio lights, and the towering palm trees, the foundation of the city was completely heavily saturated in profound municipal corruption. The local police department essentially operated as a heavily armed private security firm for the highest bidder, and the massive, sprawling geography of the city provided endless dark corners for illegal bookmaking, highly violent extortion, rackets, and raw brute force. The men who controlled these dark corners did not care about camera angles or premiere tickets. They cared entirely about territorial borders and the constant flow of raw cash. Meyer Harris Cohen was not born under the bright sun of the West Coast. He drew his first breath on September the 4th, 1913, in the densely packed, heavily impoverished Jewish enclave of Brownsville, Brooklyn. His mother, Fanny Cohen, was a Ukrainian immigrant who was completely overwhelmed by extreme poverty after her husband suddenly passed away. Desperate to find a completely new start, she borrowed a heavy sum of money, packed up her 6 young children, and took a long, suffocating train ride directly across the country to Boyle Heights, a rough working-class neighborhood situated on the east side of Los Angeles. Fanny spoke absolutely zero English and worked grueling, highly physical hours washing clothes just to keep the lights on. Because she was constantly working, her youngest son was left entirely, completely unsupervised on the dirt streets. Meyer never attended a single full year of elementary school. He was completely, functionally illiterate. At the age of 9, he was sent directly out to the busy intersections of downtown Los Angeles to sell the Evening Herald newspaper to passing motorists. In 1922, the newspaper corners were not assigned by the publishers. They were actively fought over in brutal, bloody street brawls. If you wanted the highly profitable corner of Soto and Brooklyn Avenue, you had to physically beat the previous newsboy until he stopped coming back. Meyer was small, heavily built, and possessed an incredibly short, explosive temper. He quickly realized that raw violence was the only language the streets actually respected. He started using a heavy length of lead pipe wrapped entirely in newspaper to aggressively enforce his corner territory against older, significantly heavier teenagers. By the time he was 15 years old, Meyer completely abandoned the newsstands and stepped directly into the highly unregulated, deeply corrupt world of illegal underground boxing. The local promoters convinced him that a tough Irish name would draw significantly better betting odds from the heavy drinking crowds. He officially changed his name to Mickey Cohen. He fought as a bantamweight in the smoky, poorly ventilated boxing clubs across Los Angeles, eventually traveling east to compete in Cleveland and Chicago. He was not a highly technical scientific fighter. He completely ignored defensive strategy, preferring to simply march directly forward and throw heavy, wildly aggressive right hooks until either he or his opponent completely collapsed onto the canvas. He fought dozens of professional bouts, sustaining massive physical damage to his face and hands. But the financial reality of the prize ring was highly unforgiving. He was taking brutal, agonizing beatings for absolute pennies. A standard fight purse paid roughly $50, which translates to exactly $950 in today's money. After paying his manager and his cutman Mickey barely had enough cash to afford a cheap hotel room and a steak dinner. He looked around the smoky arenas and noticed the men sitting in the absolute front rows. They were not sweating. They were wearing custom-tailored silk suits, heavy diamond rings, and smoking expensive imported cigars. They were the illegal bookmakers and syndicate enforcers who controlled the massive gambling action on the fights. Mickey immediately realized that throwing heavy punches for a completely legitimate paycheck was a profound waste of time, when the real money was made entirely in the shadows. Mickey officially retired from the boxing ring and completely threw himself into the deep, highly lucrative underworld of Chicago. During the 1930s, the Chicago outfit, originally built by Alphonse Capone, was being heavily managed by a highly intelligent, completely ruthless financial mastermind named Jake Guzik. Guzik needed men who could physically collect massive gambling debts without asking any moral questions. Mickey Cohen fit the exact physical description. He spent several years acting as a heavy armed collector, running highly illegal floating card games and actively participating in armed robberies. He completely absorbed the strict corporate structure of the syndicate, learning exactly how to heavily bribe local precinct captains and aggressively silence civilian witnesses. But Mickey was highly erratic, completely lacking the quiet discipline required to survive in the Midwestern mob. After a highly violent, completely botched robbery of an illegal card game left several rival gangsters dead on the floor, the Chicago Police Department placed a massive bounty on his head. Guzik told him to get out of town immediately, before he brought the entire weight of the federal government down on their operations. In 1939, Mickey packed a single leather suitcase and fled completely back to the sprawling sunshine of Los Angeles. When he arrived back on the West Coast, the local underworld was undergoing a massive, highly structured corporate takeover. The National Crime Syndicate in New York had officially dispatched a man to completely seize control of the highly lucrative illegal wire services that transmitted horse racing results to the local bookies. That man was Benjamin Siegel, heavily known by the local press and the police as Bugsy, a highly volatile enforcer from Murder Incorporated. Siegel was actively attempting to reinvent himself as a legitimate Hollywood socialite, but he desperately needed a local blunt instrument to handle the heavy, deeply bloody physical labor of forcing the independent bookmakers to pay the syndicate tax. He reached out directly to Mickey Cohen. The two men formed a highly effective, incredibly destructive partnership. Siegel handled the massive financial logistics and the high-profile Hollywood parties, while Mickey handled the heavy revolvers and the brass knuckles. Mickey set up a massive front operation, opening a highly expensive, meticulously decorated clothing store called Michael's Haberdashery, located directly at 8800 Sunset Boulevard. The front room sold custom silk ties and imported Italian leather shoes to famous movie stars. The heavily armored back room, completely secured by thick steel doors and armed guards, was the absolute nerve center for a massive illegal bookmaking empire that generated hundreds of thousands of dollars a week in untraceable cash. I usually completely maintain my neutrality when pulling these specific historical ledgers, but the absolute sheer naked vanity of Mickey Cohen is completely staggering to review. As the massive rivers of cash began heavily flowing into his personal accounts, his severely untreated mental idiosyncrasies aggressively amplified. Mickey developed an incredibly severe case of obsessive-compulsive disorder regarding his personal hygiene and his clothing. He absolutely refused to wear the same suit twice in a single week. His massive closets contained exactly 300 custom-tailored suits, costing roughly $250 each, which is roughly $5,000 today per suit. He owned over 1,000 custom silk shirts. But his deepest obsession was dirt. He actively washed his hands up to 60 times a day, aggressively scrubbing the skin with heavy lye soap until his knuckles completely bled. He demanded that his heavily armed bodyguards shower twice a day and wear fresh, heavily starched shirts before they were even allowed to stand next to him. He was also deeply, pathologically obsessed with the local newspaper columnists. Unlike the quiet, highly secretive bosses of the East Coast, Mickey aggressively courted the press. He actively invited reporters into his haberdashery, bought them highly expensive dinners, and constantly leaked selective information to ensure his name was printed heavily in the morning editions. He viewed himself completely as a massive local celebrity, a glittering outlaw ruling the bright neon streets. He completely forgot that the syndicate did not tolerate loud employees. On June the 20th, 1947, Benjamin Siegel was sitting quietly in the living room of his girlfriend's Beverly Hills mansion reading the Los Angeles Times. A sniper, completely concealed in the rose bushes outside, raised a heavy .30 caliber military carbine and fired 9 rounds directly through the living room window, completely obliterating Siegel's skull. The syndicate had officially canceled his contract due to massive financial overruns at the Flamingo Hotel in Las Vegas. The immediate aftermath of the assassination left a massive power vacuum on the West Coast. Mickey Cohen did not hide. He immediately marched directly into the Roosevelt Hotel, pulled a heavy .45 caliber revolver, and aggressively demanded to know exactly who ordered the hit. The local police quickly arrived and heavily disarmed him, simply charging him a minor fine for discharging a weapon. With Siegel completely out of the way, Mickey immediately declared himself the absolute, undisputed king of the Los Angeles rackets. This massive, highly arrogant declaration deeply infuriated a man who operated completely on the opposite end of the local spectrum. Enter Jack Dragna. Dragna is our primary shadow nemesis in this specific ledger. He was the official boss of the Los Angeles crime family, an old-school, highly traditional Sicilian who operated strictly out of a heavily guarded banana importing business on North Broadway. Dragna completely despised Mickey Cohen. He hated Mickey's massive wardrobe. He hated his constant presence in the newspapers, and he absolutely hated the fact that a loud, illiterate former newsboy was actively controlling the highly profitable racing wire without paying a massive tribute to the local Italian. Hierarchy. Dragna sent a heavily armed messenger directly to the haberdashery, explicitly demanding that Mickey surrender complete control of the race wire and immediately begin paying a flat 70% tax on all local bookmaking profits. Mickey stared directly at the messenger, adjusted his highly expensive silk tie, and told him to tell Jack Dragna to go completely straight to hell. The massive, highly destructive battle for Los Angeles officially began, but Jack Dragna's organization was completely plagued by severe incompetence. Over the next 4 years, Dragna ordered highly specialized hit squads to actively eliminate Mickey Cohen. Every single attempt ended in massive, highly comical failure. In August of 1948, heavily armed gunmen walked directly into the haberdashery in the middle of the afternoon. Mickey simply ducked completely into the heavily reinforced bathroom and locked the heavy steel door. The gunmen aggressively fired several rounds into the custom suits, panicked when the local police sirens wailed, and fled completely empty-handed. In early 1949, Dragna's men aggressively escalated their tactics. They completely abandoned revolvers and moved directly to high explosives. They crept heavily through the dark brush behind Mickey's massive private residence, located at 513 Moreno Avenue, in the highly exclusive neighborhood of Brentwood. They packed exactly 20 pounds of heavy TNT directly under the floorboards of the bedroom. They lit a long, slow-burning chemical fuse and ran to a waiting getaway car. The fuse actively burned completely down to the final inch, hit a patch of heavy moisture from the lawn sprinklers, and completely extinguished itself. Mickey woke up the next morning entirely, completely unaware he had been sleeping heavily on a massive explosive device. The Dragna crew returned just a few weeks later. They heavily repacked the explosives and used a significantly better fuse. At exactly 4 o'clock in the morning, the massive charge completely detonated. The sheer concussive force completely destroyed the entire front half of the massive house, blowing the heavy custom front doors entirely across the street and shattering every single window on the block. The local police aggressively swarmed the heavy wreckage, expecting to find the completely shredded remains of the mob boss. Instead, Mickey Cohen calmly walked directly out of the heavy smoke and the settling plaster dust wearing a pristine, completely unwrinkled silk bathrobe. He had simply fallen asleep on a massive custom couch on the absolute far side of the house. He looked at the local reporters gathering on the street and actively complained about the heavy damage to his expensive imported carpets. Mickey heavily believed he was completely invincible. He actively hired a massive private security detail, purchasing heavily armored Cadillacs equipped with massive bulletproof glass and heavy steel plating in the doors. He surrounded himself completely with heavily armed men. But the absolute rigid rule of the underworld is that extreme violence cannot be contained completely indefinitely. Eventually, the heavy lead finds a soft target. We must firmly pause the timeline right here to open a highly specific, deeply tragic file on the ultimate cost of Mickey's massive ego. We are going to look strictly at a man named Edward Herbert, known quietly to his friends as Nettie. Nettie was not a highly intelligent criminal mastermind. He was a simple, deeply loyal, highly unimaginative enforcer from New York who had completely relocated to the West Coast simply to work for Mickey. Nettie absolutely worshipped his boss. He loved the massive custom suits Mickey occasionally handed down to him, and he loved the heavy respect he received from the local valets when he stepped heavily out of the armored Cadillacs. Nettie was completely unarmed most of the time, serving primarily as a physical shield and a loyal companion. He had absolutely zero personal enemies in the local syndicate. If he had simply stayed in the quiet neighborhoods of New York, he likely would have lived entirely to see old age. But Nettie tied his entire physical existence directly to a man who constantly invited heavy gunfire. Which brings us directly to the exact geographic coordinates of the absolute climax. The evening of July the 20th, 1949, the heavy, warm summer air hung tightly over the neon lights of the Sunset Strip. Mickey Cohen, his wife LaVon, his top enforcer Johnny Stompanato, and his completely loyal bodyguard Nettie Herbert had just finished eating a massive, highly expensive dinner at Sherry's restaurant located exactly at 9030. 9 Sunset Boulevard. It was shortly before 4 o'clock in the morning. The restaurant was completely closed, and the massive valet parking lot was heavily deserted. The group walked slowly out of the heavy glass doors and stood firmly on the bright, heavily lit concrete sidewalk, waiting for the attendant to bring the massive armored Cadillac around to the front curb. Mickey was actively adjusting his expensive fedora, laughing heavily at a joke Stompanato had just told. They were entirely exposed under the bright marquee lights. Directly across the dark street, heavily concealed behind a massive wooden advertising billboard for a local car dealership, 2 highly trained assassins working directly for Jack Dragna were waiting patiently in the deep shadows. They were not carrying highly inaccurate revolvers. They were holding heavy 12-gauge pump-action shotguns loaded completely with heavy double-aught buckshot, designed specifically to tear through heavy steel car doors and human bone. The heavy Cadillac finally pulled up to the curb. Mickey stepped completely forward to open the heavy rear door. Across the street, the assassins aggressively racked the heavy steel slides of the shotguns, raising the heavy barrels and resting them directly on the wooden ledge of the billboard. They did not shout a heavy warning. They simply squeezed the triggers simultaneously. The absolute deafening roar of the heavy shotguns completely shattered the quiet summer night. A massive, concentrated wall of heavy lead pellets tore aggressively across the wide asphalt street. The violent crossfire was completely chaotic. Harry Cooper, a highly corrupt state investigator who had been assigned to actively follow Mickey, was instantly struck heavily in the abdomen, completely collapsing onto the hard pavement. Johnny Stompanato desperately dove completely under the heavy steel chassis of the Cadillac, aggressively dragging Levon Cohen with him. Mickey was struck immediately by a single heavy lead pellet directly in his right shoulder, spinning him aggressively around and dropping him heavily to his knees behind the open steel door of the car. But the massive, heavy center mass of the shotgun blast completely missed the boss. It struck Edward Nettie Herbert directly in the upper body. Dozens of heavy lead pellets tore violently through his expensive custom suit, completely shredding his chest cavity, puncturing both of his lungs and shattering his collarbone. The sheer physical impact lifted the loyal bodyguard entirely off his feet and threw his ruined body violently against the heavy brick exterior wall of the restaurant. He collapsed completely onto the hard concrete, leaving a massive, heavy trail of thick blood smeared actively down the brickwork. The assassins aggressively dropped the heavy smoking shotguns into the thick weeds behind the billboard, sprinted heavily down a dark residential side street, and vanished completely into a waiting getaway car before the local police sirens even began to wail in the distance. Inside the heavy trauma ward at the Queen of Angels Hospital, the massive surgical team worked desperately for several hours to completely stabilize the bleeding victims. Mickey's heavy shoulder wound was completely superficial. He was bandaged heavily and released within a few hours. He immediately called a massive press conference directly in the hospital lobby, actively displaying his blood-stained silk shirt to the flashing cameras and aggressively swearing massive revenge against Jack Dragna. He treated the absolute bloodbath like a massive promotional event for his own ego. He did not spend his time aggressively sitting by the bedside of the man who had completely taken the fatal volley meant for him. 6 days later, on July the 26th, the massive internal damage proved completely overwhelming. Nettie Herbert's heavily shredded lungs completely filled with thick fluid. As the heavy infection rapidly shut down his internal organs, the loyal bodyguard drew a highly rattled, extremely shallow breath. He looked directly at the hospital ceiling and uttered his final, completely pathetic words on this earth. "I should have stayed in Brooklyn." His heart completely stopped beating exactly 1 minute later. A completely loyal, simple man was utterly destroyed simply because he stood exactly 2 feet in the wrong direction. The absolute heavy public outrage over the bloody ambush at Sherry's restaurant completely forced the federal government to aggressively intervene. The local police could be heavily bribed, but the Internal Revenue Service absolutely did not care about local turf wars. They only cared about massive, undeclared income. The federal agents aggressively seized all of Mickey's massive financial ledgers, carefully tracking the huge cash purchases of his custom suits and armored cars. In 1951, he was officially indicted, rapidly convicted of massive income tax evasion, and sentenced heavily to 5 years in the McNeil Island Federal Penitentiary. He served the heavy time, walked completely out of the prison gates, and immediately went right back to his highly publicized, completely arrogant lifestyle. He started heavily appearing on local television talk shows, aggressively claiming he was completely reformed, while secretly reorganizing his massive extortion rackets. But the federal government was absolutely entirely tired of the massive public spectacle. In 1961, they aggressively indicted him a second time for massive tax fraud. This time, the federal judge did not send him to a quiet island. The judge heavily sentenced him to 15 years and explicitly ordered him transported directly to the absolute most violent, highly secured concrete box in the entire federal system. Mickey Cohen was officially processed directly into Alcatraz Island. He was stripped completely of his massive custom suits, forced entirely into a heavily starched, deeply uncomfortable federal uniform, and locked inside a tiny freezing concrete cell in the notorious D Block. His massive wealth and heavy celebrity status meant absolutely nothing inside the heavy concrete walls. He was just another number shivering heavily in the freezing salt fog. On the freezing morning of August the 14th, 1963, Mickey was walking slowly across the massive concrete exercise yard. He was 50 years old, his heavy boxing physique significantly softened by age and poor prison food. He completely failed to notice a highly dangerous, severely unstable fellow inmate named Burl Estes McDonald quietly stepped directly out of the heavy shadows of the cell block door. McDonald was not acting on syndicate orders. He simply intensely hated Mickey's massive, arrogant attitude. McDonald was tightly gripping a heavy 3-foot length of solid lead pipe that he had carefully smuggled directly out of the prison machine shop. McDonald aggressively ran silently across the hard concrete yard, raised the heavy lead pipe completely above his head with both hands, and brought it violently down directly onto the back of Mickey Cohen's unprotected skull. The sheer heavy force of the brutal impact completely fractured the massive bone, violently driving bone fragments directly into his brain tissue. Mickey completely collapsed instantly onto the freezing concrete, completely unresponsive, bleeding heavily from the massive head wound. The former absolute king of the Sunset Strip never fully completely recovered. The massive neurological damage left him heavily, permanently paralyzed on the entire right side of his body. He completely lost the ability to walk unassisted. When Alcatraz officially closed, he was heavily transferred directly to the federal medical facility in Springfield, Missouri, where he spent the remainder of his massive sentence heavily confined to a metal wheelchair aggressively, complaining to anyone who would listen that the government had failed. To protect him, he was eventually released entirely for severe medical reasons. He spent his final, highly pathetic years living heavily in a small, quiet apartment, actively launching massive, highly unsuccessful civil lawsuits against the federal government, attempting to collect millions of dollars in damages for the severe pipe attack. The man who had aggressively ordered the brutal beatings of dozens of men was completely reduced to begging the legal system for a massive cash payout. He completely died entirely in his sleep, in his bed on July the 24th, 1976. The massive shadow nemesis Jack Dragna did not survive to completely enjoy the heavy downfall of his bitter rival. Dragna actively fled Los Angeles after the federal government aggressively issued a massive warrant for his own heavily documented deportation. He completely died of a massive sudden heart attack directly inside a highly cheap, incredibly filthy motel room in 1956, leaving absolutely zero lasting legacy behind him. The heavily armored Cadillacs, the custom-tailored silk suits, and the massive underground bookmaking empires were completely dismantled and forgotten. The brutal war for the bright streets of Los Angeles was completely extinguished by the heavy, unyielding weight of the federal government. But while the West Coast syndicates were heavily fighting over betting slips and movie studio extortion, a massively different, significantly more profound civil war had already completely permanently altered the absolute foundation of organized crime thousands of miles back east. A heavily violent conflict that would officially completely transition the underworld from crude street thugs directly into a massive, highly efficient corporate empire. The harsh, unyielding landscape of western Sicily in the late 1800s was a place of extreme geographical and economic punishment. In the small, heavily sun-baked coastal town of Castellammarese del Golfo, survival was dictated entirely by the deep sulfur mines and the unforgiving Mediterranean Sea. Young boys were forced to work 14-hour shifts deep underground, breathing heavy, toxic dust until their spines completely bent and their lungs gave out. Desperate to escape the crushing poverty and the deeply entrenched local mafia, thousands of Sicilian families packed their meager belongings into heavy canvas bags and boarded massive, overcrowded steamships bound for the United States. They endured weeks of seasickness and heavy disease in the dark, suffocating steerage compartments, completely driven by the promise of the American dream. But when they finally passed through the heavy brick halls of Ellis Island and settled into the densely packed, sweltering tenement buildings of Lower Manhattan and Brooklyn, they realized the absolute brutal truth. They had crossed a massive, violent ocean, only to find that the very predators they were desperately trying to escape had simply booked passage on the exact same ships. The ancient, highly destructive system of neighborhood extortion, brutal vendettas, and absolute silent obedience had firmly taken root in the cracking asphalt of New York City. The older generation of crime bosses who controlled these neighborhoods were completely rooted in the old world traditions. The younger street enforcers quietly referred to them as the mustache pates. They were deeply conservative, heavily paranoid men who refused to do business with anyone who did not originate from their specific tiny village in Italy. And their extreme, violent stubbornness eventually dragged the entire city into a massive, highly destructive civil war that permanently altered the structure of the American underworld. To completely understand the sheer scale of the blood spilled on the cobblestone streets during the Castellammarese War, we have to pull the files on the two massive dinosaurs who aggressively tore the city apart. Standing on one side of the battlefield was Giuseppe Masseria, heavily known by the local press, and his terrified subjects as Joe the Boss. Masseria was a short, heavily overweight, incredibly gluttonous man who completely controlled the massively profitable bootlegging and extortion rackets in Little Italy and East Harlem. He ate like a starving animal, routinely consuming massive plates of pasta, heavy cuts of roasted meat, and gallons of strong red wine in a single sitting. He ruled his empire entirely through absolute brute force and a heavily cultivated myth of physical invincibility. In August of 1922, Masseria was walking down 2nd Avenue when two rival, heavily armed button men aggressively ambushed him. They fired massive blasts from heavy shotguns at point-blank range. Masseria frantically dove into a heavily fronted millinery shop. The heavy lead buckshot completely shattered the thick plate glass window and blew his expensive straw hat entirely off his head, but he remained completely miraculously unhurt. The local immigrant population, deeply steeped in old-world superstitions, actively believed he possessed the evil eye and was completely immune to police bullets. Masseria actively encouraged this massive delusion, demanding extreme, suffocating loyalty and a massive cut of every single illegal dollar generated in his territory. Standing on the exact opposite side of the heavy dividing line was Salvatore Maranzano. Maranzano was the undisputed leader of the Castellammarese faction, operating primarily out of heavily fortified social clubs in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, and the Bronx. He was the absolute antithesis of the gluttonous Masseria. Maranzano was tall, highly educated, and spoke multiple languages. He kept heavy, leather-bound volumes of Julius Caesar's commentaries on the Gallic Wars sitting directly on his massive wooden desk. He actively studied ancient Roman military tactics and deeply viewed himself as a brilliant, highly sophisticated military general leading a massive, righteous army. I usually keep entirely neutral when digging through these old dusty archives, but the absolute sheer arrogance required to order the brutal drive by executions of dozens of men while sitting comfortably in a velvet chair reading Latin poetry completely baffles me. Maranzano financed his massive underworld army through a highly organized alien smuggling ring, actively sneaking undocumented Italian immigrants directly across the Canadian border, and through massive, highly aggressive bootlegging operations. He looked across the East River at Joe Masseria, saw a completely uneducated fat street thug, and decided it was time to completely eradicate him from the map. The massive rivers of untraceable cash generated by the Prohibition era provided the absolute heavy fuel for the impending war. We are talking about staggering sums of money. A highly successful local bootlegger could easily generate over $100,000 a single week in 1930. That translates to roughly $1.8 million a week in today's money. With that level of massive capital sitting heavily on the table, neither boss was willing to negotiate a peaceful territorial truce. The first massive strike of the war occurred in February of 1930, and it completely centered around the highly lucrative ice rackets in the Bronx. Before the widespread invention of the electric refrigerator, every single tenement family in the city absolutely relied on heavy blocks of solid ice to keep their milk and cheap cuts of meat from completely rotting in the suffocating summer heat. The ice industry was an absolute massive gold mine. A man named Gaetano Reina completely controlled the primary ice distribution network in the Bronx. He was a highly efficient, deeply respected earner. But Joe Masseria, driven by his massive, unquenchable greed, aggressively demanded that Reyna hand over a significantly larger percentage of his weekly ice profits. Reyna silently refused and quietly began making heavy financial overtures to Salvatore Maranzano. Masseria immediately discovered the massive betrayal and ordered a permanent solution. On the freezing evening of February the 26th, 1930, Gaetano Reyna stepped out of his aunt's warm apartment building on Sheridan Avenue in the Bronx. He was wearing a heavy wool overcoat, walking slowly toward his parked vehicle. A young, highly ambitious triggerman named Vito Genovese stepped quietly out of the deep shadows of an adjacent alleyway. Genovese was carrying a heavy, double-barreled 12-gauge shotgun. He did not shout a warning. He raised the heavy weapon and fired a single deafening blast directly into the back of Reyna's head. Reyna completely collapsed onto the freezing concrete, his heavy blood rapidly melting the dirty snow on the sidewalk. When you read the highly romanticized historical ledgers of the Mafia, they often portray these targeted hits as clean, highly professional business transactions between willing combatants. They completely ignore the massive, heavy collateral damage inflicted on the innocent civilian population. The murder of Gaetano Reyna did not just change the leadership of the Bronx underworld, it directly triggered a massive, highly aggressive extortion campaign against the completely innocent independent ice delivery men and the small local shopkeepers. We must open a very specific, deeply grounded file on the absolute true cost of this heavy transition. When Masseria installed his completely loyal, highly brutal enforcer Joe Pinzolo to completely take over the Bronx ice racket, the prices for a standard block of ice were aggressively doubled overnight. Let us look at a 50-year-old immigrant baker operating a tiny, highly suffocating storefront on Arthur Avenue. He barely made enough pennies to feed his own children. When Pinzolo's heavily armed thugs walked into his small bakery, smelling heavily of cheap cologne and old sweat, they aggressively demanded a new heavily increased protection tax of $50 a week, which is roughly $900 today. The baker simply did not have the cash in the register. He begged them for a few extra days. The enforcers did not negotiate. They walked entirely out of the shop, returned at 3 o'clock the next morning, and threw a highly volatile, heavy black powder pipe bomb directly through the front plate glass window. The massive explosion completely destroyed the heavy commercial ovens, ignited a massive fire in the flour sacks, and completely ruined a lifetime of grueling, back-breaking labor in a single second. The baker's teenage son, who was sleeping on a small cot in the back storage room, was permanently blinded in his right eye by the massive shower of shattered glass. There was absolutely zero honor in this war. The heavy millions of dollars financing the custom suits and the armored Cadillacs of Masseria and Maranzano were violently squeezed directly from the empty pockets of terrified, completely helpless immigrants who could not even afford a train ticket out of the neighborhood. By the summer of 1930, the Castellammarese War had completely transformed the crowded streets of New York into a highly active, incredibly lethal combat zone. Over 60 men were brutally murdered in a matter of months. Heavily weighted bodies wrapped tightly in thick chains were constantly being dragged out of the murky, freezing waters of the East River. Men were gunned down in crowded barbershops, their heavy blood completely soaking the white ceramic tiles. But as the massive body count aggressively climbed, a highly observant, deeply pragmatic younger generation of mobsters was watching the old mustache Petes bleed each other completely dry. This younger faction was led by men like Charles Lucky, Luciano Meyer Lansky, and Frank Costello. They were heavily involved in massive, highly complex bootlegging operations, and they were completely exhausted by the ancient Sicilian vendettas. They wanted to aggressively expand their business, which explicitly required forming highly profitable partnerships with the powerful Jewish and Irish syndicates. But Masseria and Maranzano flatly refused, aggressively referring to non-Sicilians as schifiosi, a highly derogatory term meaning absolute scum. It always heavily annoys me when historical ledgers try to paint these younger mobsters as progressive, forward-thinking visionaries who just wanted to bring peace to the local neighborhoods. They absolutely did not want peace for the sake of the innocent bakers or the terrified pushcart vendors. They simply wanted to completely streamline the industrial slaughter so they could sit quietly in back rooms and count their massive heavy stacks of untraceable cash without having to constantly look over their shoulders for stray shotgun pellets. Lucky Luciano was ostensibly Joe Massaria's absolute top lieutenant, his primary strategist. But Luciano recognized that Massaria's massive, completely unorganized street army was slowly losing the long war of attrition against Maranzano's highly disciplined military-style Castellammarese forces. Massaria was actively hemorrhaging raw cash, and his most loyal, highly experienced enforcers were being systematically gunned down in the streets. Luciano made a massive, completely cold-blooded corporate calculation. He secretly reached out directly to Salvatore Maranzano and negotiated a highly clandestine, absolutely treacherous backroom deal. Luciano promised to explicitly remove Joe Massaria from the heavy board, completely ending the massive war in exchange for absolute control over Massaria's lucrative rackets and a massive seat at the new high table. Maranzano heavily agreed to the terms, which brings us directly to the exact geographic coordinates of the absolute climax. The highly anticipated afternoon of April the 15th, 1931, the freezing salt air was whipping heavily off the gray waters of the Atlantic Ocean, cutting aggressively across the completely deserted wooden boardwalk of Coney Island. The summer crowds had not yet arrived, leaving the streets feeling completely hollow and deeply isolated. Joe Massaria absolutely loved the Nuova Villa Tamaro restaurant, located exactly at 2715 West 15th Street. He loved the massive portions of heavy pasta, the highly specialized imported red wine, and the absolute privacy it afforded him. Lucky Luciano actively invited his massive boss to the restaurant for a highly secretive, deeply important strategy meeting to discuss the failing war effort. Massaria arrived in a heavily armored Cadillac, completely flanked by his armed bodyguards, but Luciano explicitly instructed the guards to wait outside on the cold street. The two men sat entirely alone at a small, heavy wooden table covered by a pristine white linen cloth in the main dining room. They ate a massive, incredibly heavy lunch of fresh lobsters, thick spaghetti, completely drenched in heavy garlic marinara sauce, and consumed multiple bottles of strong Chianti. After the heavy plates were completely cleared by the terrified restaurant owner, who quickly vanished into the back kitchen, Massaria and Luciano pulled out a worn deck of heavy playing cards and began playing a quiet game of Scopa. The air in the room was incredibly thick with cigar smoke and the heavy smell of roasted garlic. At exactly 3:30 in the afternoon, Luciano slowly pushed his heavy wooden chair back from the table. He quietly excused himself, telling Massaria he needed to use the men's restroom. Luciano walked completely calmly across the highly polished floor, stepped firmly into the tiled bathroom, and locked the heavy wooden door behind him. He walked over to the porcelain sink, turned on the cold water, and slowly began washing his hands. He took his absolute time, scrubbing the heavy soap deeply into his palms, listening intently over the sound of the running water. Less than 30 seconds after the bathroom door clicked shut, the heavy glass front doors of the Nuova Villa Tamaro swung violently open. 4 men wearing heavy dark wool overcoats and tightly pulled fedoras stepped completely into the quiet dining room. The official police ledgers fiercely debate the exact identities of the triggermen, but the heavy underworld consensus places Benjamin Bugsy, Siegel, Vito, Genovese, Albert Anastasia, and Joe Adonis in the room. They completely bypassed the empty wooden bar. They did not wear heavy masks. They did not shout a single warning to the massive boss sitting at the card table. They drew heavy 38 caliber revolvers and highly accurate 32 caliber automatic pistols from their deep coat pockets. Massaria looked up from his heavy cards, his massive eyes completely widening in absolute realization as the heavy steel barrels were raised directly toward his face. The 4 assassins completely opened fire simultaneously. The absolute deafening roar of the heavy weapons completely shattered the quiet afternoon, echoing violently against the heavy wooden paneling of the empty restaurant. Exactly 20 heavy lead rounds were fired in less than 10 seconds. The crossfire was incredibly intense and completely overwhelming. 6 heavy slugs found their exact mark. 2 bullets tore aggressively through Masseria's massive chest, shredding his internal organs. Another heavy round struck him directly in the upper back. The final absolute fatal shot entered completely through the back of his massive skull, instantly severing his brain stem. The physical impact of the heavy lead knocked his massive frame violently forward. Joe Masseria completely collapsed face first onto the white linen tablecloth. His heavy blood rapidly pooled across the white fabric, completely mixing with the leftover marinara sauce from his massive lunch. There were absolutely zero philosophical final words. There was no highly dramatic, poetic reflection on a life built on extreme violence. He was shot in the absolute back while holding his playing cards. And he died completely mute, his jaw locked heavily mid-chew. A heavily circulated press photograph taken later that afternoon showed his massive, lifeless hand tightly clutching the ace of spades. Though heavy historical evidence highly suggests a local newspaper photographer intentionally planted the card there to sell a more highly dramatic narrative to the evening papers. When the local police finally arrived, the 4 heavily armed assassins were completely gone, vanished entirely into the cold Coney Island air. Lucky Luciano completely calmly stepped out of the locked bathroom, adjusted his expensive silk tie, and stared coldly at the heavily bleeding corpse of his former boss. When the homicide detectives aggressively interrogated him, Luciano simply shrugged his shoulders and stated that the massive, heavy wooden door of the restroom must have completely muffled the sound of 20 gunshots. The immediate aftermath of the bloody assassination officially completely ended the Castellammarese War. Salvatore Maranzano emerged as the absolute undisputed victor. He aggressively called a massive, highly structured meeting of over 500 Italian mobsters in a heavy rental hall in the Bronx. He stood at a massive wooden podium speaking in highly fluid Latin and Italian and officially declared himself the capo di tutti capi, the absolute boss of all bosses. He aggressively reorganized the chaotic New York underworld into 5 distinct, highly structured crime families, laying the absolute foundation for the modern American Mafia. He demanded absolute obedience and a massive, heavy tribute from every single illegal operation in the city. He thought he was a highly brilliant Roman emperor taking absolute control of a newly conquered territory. He was completely fatally wrong. The younger generation, led entirely by Luciano, had absolutely no intention of replacing one greedy, highly demanding mustache Pete with another. They had simply used Maranzano to completely eliminate Masseria. Exactly 5 months later, on the afternoon of September the 10th, 1931, Maranzano was sitting quietly inside his massive, heavily fortified corporate office, located on the 9th floor of the prestigious New York Central building on Park Avenue. He felt completely invincible behind his heavy oak desk. 4 highly trained Jewish hitmen, provided directly by Meyer Lansky, walked completely calmly into the heavy marble lobby of the building. They were dressed entirely in pristine, crisp suits, carrying heavy leather briefcases completely disguised as federal tax agents. They walked directly into Maranzano's private suite, aggressively disarmed his massive bodyguards, and stormed entirely into the inner office. They did not bother using heavy revolvers right away. They completely pinned the massive boss of bosses directly against the heavy wood paneling and violently stabbed him repeatedly in the chest and stomach with heavy, thick-bladed hunting knives, tearing his internal organs completely. To absolutely ensure the contract was fulfilled, they finally drew heavy automatic pistols and shot him completely dead, leaving his bleeding corpse tangled violently in the expensive carpets of his massive Roman Empire. The era of the mustache pates was completely extinguished. The ancient, highly destructive Sicilian vendettas were entirely replaced by a highly efficient, massively corporate syndicate model. The commission was officially established, completely transforming organized crime from bloody street brawls into a massive multi-million-dollar national corporation. And as this massive new corporate machine stabilized its heavy borders in New York, It aggressively began looking directly toward the barren, heavily baked deserts of the American West, seeking completely new, highly profitable frontiers where a man could build a massive, glittering empire on a foundation of heavy sand stolen, cash, and highly suppressed extreme violence. The transition of absolute underworld power did not simply stop at the chaotic, blood-stained cobblestones of the East Coast or the neon-soaked intersections of Los Angeles. While the massive Eastern crime families were heavily consolidating their operations following the brutal Castellammarese War, a completely new, vastly different geographic frontier was quietly opening up in the absolute middle of nowhere. The Mojave Desert in the 1940s was a massive, highly unforgiving wasteland of baked alkali dust, heavy sagebrush, and suffocating, relentless heat. There was absolutely nothing out there except a few isolated watering holes and a tiny, completely lawless railroad town called Las Vegas. It was a place where desperate men went to quietly disappear. But the heavy, highly structured national crime syndicate did not look at the barren sand and see a wasteland. They saw a massive, completely unregulated blank canvas. They saw a highly profitable future, completely free from the heavy surveillance of the federal government. And the man they explicitly dispatched to carve that highly lucrative empire out of the raw dirt was a deeply unstable, highly violent sociopath who desperately wanted to be a Hollywood star. Benjamin Siegel was not born anywhere near the bright sunshine of the American West. He drew his very first breath in 1906, born directly into the absolute crushing poverty of Williamsburg, Brooklyn. His parents were Jewish immigrants from the Russian Empire who worked grueling, highly physical hours for absolute pennies just to keep their children from starving in the heavily cramped, deeply suffocating tenement buildings. The air in his childhood neighborhood constantly smelled of boiling cabbage, raw sewage, and heavy coal smoke. Benjamin looked at the heavily blistered, exhausted hands of his parents and decided at a very early age that he would completely refuse to ever work a legitimate, back-breaking job. He was a highly aggressive, incredibly volatile teenager. While other local kids were stealing cheap apples from the corner pushcarts, Benjamin was actively extorting the pushcart owners, threatening to heavily burn their wooden carts to ashes if they did not hand over a weekly protection tax of $1, which is roughly $18 in today's money. He quickly formed a highly violent, completely unbreakable partnership with another local street kid named Meyer Lansky. Lansky is our primary shadow nemesis in this specific ledger, and he was the absolute physical and mental antithesis of Siegel. Lansky was incredibly small, highly quiet, and possessed the cold, heavily calculating brain of a corporate accountant. Siegel was tall, heavily muscled, fiercely handsome, and completely possessed by an explosive, highly unpredictable temper that terrified the older gang members. The local street thugs quietly started calling him Bugsy, a heavy slang term, meaning he was as completely crazy as a bedbug. Siegel absolutely intensely hated the nickname. If any man dared to call him Bugsy directly to his face, Siegel would instantly violently attack them, aggressively fracturing their jaws and heavy ribs with heavy lead pipes or brass knuckles. He demanded complete, absolute respect, and he enforced that demand through raw, unhinged physical violence. Together, the two teenagers formed the Bugs and Meyer Mob, a heavily armed crew that explicitly specialized in providing armed protection for the massive, illegal floating dice games operated by the older Jewish racketeers. When the federal government officially enacted Prohibition, Siegel and Lansky aggressively pivoted their entire operation into the massive, highly lucrative world of illegal bootlegging. Siegel did not sit quietly in the back offices counting the heavy stacks of cash. He actively rode shotgun on the massive, heavily loaded liquor trucks, holding a heavy Thompson submachine gun in his lap. He explicitly enjoyed the heavy adrenaline of the highway hijackings. When rival Irish or Italian gangs attempted to aggressively block their heavily loaded convoys, Siegel did not attempt to negotiate. He completely opened sustained heavy automatic fire directly into their vehicles, leaving bleeding, completely ruined bodies highly visible on the dark rural highways. His extreme, complete willingness to actively execute men at point-blank range eventually caught the attention of the Italian Commission. When the National Syndicate officially formed, Murder Incorporated, the heavily armed enforcement wing stationed in Brooklyn, Benjamin Siegel was brought in as a highly specialized, absolute top-tier contract killer. But Benjamin Siegel suffered from a massive, completely fatal character flaw. He was deeply pathologically vain. He heavily despised the filthy, blood-stained reality of being a completely anonymous street enforcer. He actively rubbed heavy, expensive skin creams onto his face every single night. He completely slept with a heavy, highly restrictive leather chin strap strapped tightly around his head to absolutely prevent the formation of a double chin. He wanted to wear heavily customized silk suits and stand under bright, expensive lights. In the late 1930s, the massive National Syndicate recognized his severe restlessness and officially completely transferred him to the West Coast. His strict orders were to aggressively consolidate the illegal bookmaking and wire services in Los Angeles and funnel the massive profits directly back to the East Coast bosses. When Siegel arrived in Los Angeles, he completely ignored the quiet, heavily secretive operational rules of the syndicate. He actively threw himself completely into the glittering, highly public world of the Hollywood elite. He moved directly into a massive, heavily gated mansion in Holmby Hills. He threw incredibly expensive, highly lavish parties heavily attended by famous movie stars like Clark Gable, Cary Grant, and George Raft. He actively forced the heavy studio executives to grant him highly expensive, completely useless screen tests, genuinely believing his fierce good looks would make him a massive leading man. When the studios quietly rejected his complete lack of acting talent, Siegel completely reverted directly to his primary language. He heavily organized the massive Screen Extras Guild, effectively taking completely absolute control over the thousands of anonymous background actors required to shoot massive epic films. He then marched directly into the heavily guarded offices of the major studio moguls and aggressively demanded massive off-the-books cash payouts of up to $50,000, roughly $1 million in today's currency, explicitly promising that if they failed to pay, he would order massive, highly violent strikes that would completely shut down the entire motion picture industry. The studio bosses were completely terrified of his violent reputation. They paid the heavy extortion fees completely in silence. But Siegel's massive, highly expensive Hollywood lifestyle was actively draining his personal finances. He desperately needed a completely new massive revenue stream to maintain his heavy social standing. He looked directly out past the city limits, completely across the barren, heavy dirt of the Nevada desert. The historical ledgers completely falsely credit Benjamin Siegel with explicitly inventing the city of Las Vegas. That is a massive, heavily fabricated myth entirely created by Hollywood screenwriters. The absolute true genesis of the Las Vegas Strip began entirely with a legitimate, highly ambitious publisher named William R. Wilkerson. Wilkerson owned the famous Hollywood Reporter and several highly successful nightclubs in Los Angeles. He had heavily purchased a massive, completely barren tract of dirt directly on Highway 91 in Nevada, explicitly intending to build a highly luxurious European-style resort and casino called the Flamingo. Wilkerson successfully poured the heavy concrete foundations and began framing the massive walls, but he suffered from a massive, completely uncontrollable gambling addiction. He actively lost hundreds of thousands of dollars at the local poker tables and completely ran out of raw cash to finish the massive construction project. The local banks flatly refused to lend him another single dime. This is exactly when Benjamin Siegel stepped entirely into the picture. Armed completely with massive, heavily unregulated cash reserves provided directly by the East Coast Syndicate, Siegel aggressively purchased a massive 2/3 controlling stake in the Flamingo project. Initially, Wilkerson believed he had completely found a highly silent, deeply wealthy financial partner. He was completely, fatally wrong. Within a few short months, Siegel began aggressively making massive, highly erratic changes to the architectural blueprints. He heavily demanded private plumbing in every single room, massive imported marble floors, and highly expensive, heavily imported exotic landscaping in the absolute middle of a dead desert. When Wilkerson gently attempted to push back against the massive, heavily escalating costs, Siegel completely cornered the publisher in a small, highly dusty construction trailer. He heavily pulled a .38 caliber revolver, placed it completely flat against Wilkerson's chest, and explicitly informed him that the project completely belonged to the syndicate now. Wilkerson completely fled to Paris in absolute, heavily justified fear for his own life, completely abandoning his massive desert dream. Siegel officially completely took over the massive construction site. But Benjamin Siegel was a highly violent street killer, completely devoid of any basic logistical or financial management skills. The massive construction of the Flamingo occurred heavily during the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. Basic building materials like heavy steel, copper wire, and poured concrete were heavily rationed by the federal government and completely incredibly difficult to acquire legally. Siegel was completely forced to purchase these heavy materials directly on the illegal black market. I usually keep my absolute neutrality when aggressively digging through these specific financial ledgers, but the absolute sheer naked incompetence displayed by Benjamin Siegel during this specific construction phase makes my teeth aggressively grind. The local Nevada contractors completely recognized that the massive mob boss was entirely distracted by his own vanity. They absolutely robbed him, completely blind. Heavy transport trucks loaded completely with highly expensive copper piping would pull directly up to the front gate of the Flamingo. Siegel would blindly sign the heavy paper invoice, explicitly authorizing a massive cash payment. The truck driver would then simply drive completely around the block to the back service gate, completely unload the exact same shipment of copper, and actively sell it to Siegel all over again the very next morning. Siegel actively paid for the exact same heavy materials 3 or 4 times over, simply because he completely refused to hire legitimate, highly trained inventory accountants. We must pause the timeline directly here to firmly open a highly specific, deeply grounded file on the heavy collateral damage caused by this massive incompetence. The romanticized movies completely portray Siegel as a highly charming, deeply misunderstood visionary. They completely ignore the absolute living hell he actively inflicted on the completely legitimate, highly skilled construction foreman who actually built the massive hotel. Let us look exactly at the heavy daily reality of the Del Webb Construction Company. Del Webb was a completely legitimate, highly respected general contractor. He was entirely responsible for actually keeping the massive walls from completely collapsing into the sand. Webb and his legitimate foreman lived in a completely constant state of absolute physical terror. Siegel was heavily erratic, completely prone to massive screaming fits of violent rage if a specific shipment of imported tile arrived slightly late. If a completely innocent, highly skilled, legitimate union plumber complained about unsafe working conditions or a missing paycheck, Siegel would heavily aggressively trap the man against a concrete wall and actively boast loudly about the dozens of men he had personally murdered with his own bare hands in Brooklyn. Siegel once famously noticed Del Webb looking extremely nervous during a massive, highly violent outburst. Siegel completely smiled, patted Webb heavily on the shoulder, and explicitly told him not to worry, claiming that the mob only killed each other. That was a complete, absolute lie. It was cold comfort to a completely legitimate man who simply wanted to pour heavy concrete and go home to his family. The completely legitimate contractors suffered from severe, massive bleeding stomach ulcers and complete nervous breakdowns, heavily forced to build a massive illegal neon empire completely under the direct, highly explicit threat of a shallow, completely unmarked grave in the deep desert scrub. The massive original budget for the Flamingo was heavily estimated at roughly $1.2 million, which translates to exactly $18 million in today's money. Under Siegel's highly erratic, completely incompetent leadership, the massive budget absolutely exploded to over $6 million, roughly $90 million today. The massive East Coast bosses who were directly financing the massive construction were entirely losing their patience. The heavy rivers of cash were completely draining their reserves, and they heavily suspected that Siegel and his highly famous gun moll, a woman named Virginia Hill, were actively, completely skimming the massive construction funds, secretly, heavily smuggling the raw cash across international borders to heavily secure Swiss bank accounts. In December of 1946, the absolute highest-ranking members of the National Syndicate completely convened a highly secretive, massive corporate meeting at the Hotel Nacional in Havana, Cuba. The heavy Havana conference was heavily attended by Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, and Meyer Lansky. They sat completely around a massive, heavy wooden table filled entirely with thick accounting ledgers and heavily smoked, expensive cigars. The absolute primary topic of heavy discussion was the massive, highly bleeding wound in the Nevada desert. The heavy bosses aggressively demanded completely absolute permission to permanently eliminate Benjamin Siegel. The only man in the entire smoke-filled room who actively defended him was Meyer Lansky. Lansky was his absolute oldest friend. They had completely bled together heavily on the filthy streets of Williamsburg. Lansky desperately pleaded for more time, explicitly arguing that once the massive hotel officially opened, the massive gambling profits would quickly repay the heavy $90 million debt. The commission reluctantly, completely agreed to wait until after the massive grand opening. On December the 26th, 1946, the Flamingo completely officially opened its heavy glass doors to the public. It was a massive, completely unmitigated disaster. The heavy Nevada weather was incredibly terrible, pouring massive freezing rain directly onto the desert floor. The massive, highly expensive hotel rooms were not even completely finished, meaning the wealthy Hollywood guests completely gambled at Siegel's heavy felt tables for a few hours and then simply took their massive winnings and walked completely down the dirt road to sleep heavily at the rival El Rancho Vegas Hotel. The massive casino heavily lost exactly $300,000 in its absolute first week of operation, which equates to roughly $4.5 million today. Siegel was completely humiliated. He abruptly, aggressively, completely closed the massive resort and spent 3 completely frantic months attempting to completely finish the heavy construction. He finally completely reopened the Flamingo in March of 1947. By May, the massive casino actually began turning a very small, highly incremental profit. Siegel completely believed he had successfully entirely saved his own life. He heavily believed the massive syndicate would look at the small black numbers in the ledger and completely forgive the massive $90 million theft. He was absolutely, completely, fatally wrong. The highly calculated corporate structure of the underworld completely, absolutely does not forgive heavy theft or massive public embarrassment. Meyer Lansky sat in a quiet, heavily guarded room in New York and completely looked at the massive, finalized financial ledgers. Lansky was a corporate accountant entirely at heart. He completely realized that his oldest friend was absolutely, completely unmanageable, highly dangerous, and entirely too loud. The shadow nemesis officially, completely, quietly signed the massive death warrant for his childhood partner. Business completely, absolutely took total precedence over blood, which brings us directly to the exact geographic coordinates of the absolute massive climax. The heavily warm, deeply quiet evening of June the 20th, 1947. Benjamin Siegel was completely, entirely relaxed in the highly exclusive, heavily manicured neighborhood of Beverly Hills, California. He was completely inside a massive, highly expensive Moorish-style mansion located exactly at 810 Linden Drive. The massive property was heavily rented by his girlfriend, Virginia Hill. Hill was highly conveniently completely out of the country, traveling heavily, entirely, across Europe after a massive screaming argument with Siegel just a few days prior. Siegel was sitting heavily on a massive, highly expensive floral-patterned sofa located directly in the center of the massive living room. He was sitting entirely directly next to his heavily armed associate, Alan Smiley. Siegel was completely dressed in a crisp, highly expensive white dress shirt and a heavy, heavily tailored houndstooth jacket. He was completely, entirely ignoring his own heavy security protocols. The massive, heavy living room curtains were left completely, absolutely wide open. The bright, highly expensive interior lamps heavily, completely illuminated Siegel against the absolute dark, pitch-black night outside. He was simply completely quietly reading the late edition of the Los Angeles Times. Directly outside, the massive house, heavily completely concealed in the deep dark shadows of the highly manicured rose bushes, a heavily armed, completely highly trained sniper, quietly rested the cold steel barrel of a heavy .30 caliber M1 military carbine completely firmly against the heavy, wooden window frame. The distance between the heavy steel muzzle and Siegel's head was barely 15 feet. There was absolutely no heavy warning. There was no highly dramatic, poetic final speech reflecting heavily on a life completely built entirely on extreme violence. The sniper completely heavily squeezed the trigger. Exactly 9 heavy rounds of highly lethal full metal jacket ammunition tore violently entirely through the heavy plate glass window. The massive glass completely shattered inward. The heavy lead slugs completely crossed the quiet living room in an absolute fraction of a second. 2 heavy, highly destructive rounds struck Benjamin Siegel directly, completely in the upper chest, heavily shredding his massive lungs and violently snapping his heavy ribs. But the absolute, completely fatal round struck him entirely directly in the right cheek. The heavy military slug completely traveled heavily through his skull and violently blew his left eye entirely, completely out of its socket. The heavy, completely severed eyeball flew entirely across the massive living room and landed heavily, completely wetly, on the opposite side of the highly polished floor, coming to absolute rest directly near the heavy brick fireplace. The sheer massive physical force of the heavy military rounds violently snapped Siegel's head, completely aggressively back, throwing his entirely ruined, heavily bleeding body violently over the back of the massive floral sofa. He did completely not utter a single absolute final word. He died entirely, completely mute, his heavily manicured, highly expensive hands still tightly aggressively gripping the crumpled newspaper. His massive, highly prized Hollywood face, the absolute complete center of his massive, highly destructive vanity, was completely, entirely obliterated into raw meat and shattered bone. The heavily armed shooter calmly, completely lowered the hot weapon and vanished entirely, completely into the heavy, deeply dark Beverly Hills night. The official, heavily unredacted police ledgers never directly named the absolute triggerman, leaving the heavily executed contract completely officially unsolved. The massive cold facts of the immediate aftermath absolutely completely strip away any lingering Hollywood glamour. Exactly 20 minutes after the heavy bullets completely shattered the glass on Linden Drive, 3 massive, highly ranked syndicate enforcers, Mo Sedway, Gus Greenbaum, and Morris Rosen, casually, completely calmly walked entirely through the heavy front glass doors of the Flamingo Hotel in Las Vegas. They did not carry heavy shotguns. They simply walked entirely directly up to the completely terrified casino manager, heavily informed him that Benjamin Siegel was completely dead, and officially, completely, entirely took over the massive counting rooms. The entire massive corporate takeover was highly organized and completely, absolutely bloodless. Virginia Hill, the highly famous gun moll who had heavily smuggled the massive cash, completely successfully avoided the heavy syndicate fallout. But she absolutely did not find a highly glamorous, happy ending. She completely fled entirely to Europe, heavily evading massive federal tax evasion indictments for decades. 19 years later, in March of 1966, entirely, completely broke, and heavily isolated, she walked entirely alone, directly into a massive freezing snowbank in Koppel, Austria. She swallowed a massive, heavy handful of strong sleeping pills and completely, entirely died of a massive, heavily intentional overdose in the freezing, absolute cold snow. Benjamin Siegel threw roughly $90 million of incredibly dirty, highly bloody syndicate money completely directly into the Nevada sand, simply to absolutely, completely satisfy his massive, highly unquenchable ego. He heavily wanted to be completely immortalized as a massive Hollywood star. He ended up entirely, completely butchered like a rabid animal on a floral sofa, highly remembered by the cold archives, entirely, completely for a heavily severed eyeball resting on a living room floor. The massive syndicates now completely controlled the sprawling, highly lucrative western deserts and the heavily crowded eastern city streets. But while they were entirely heavily focused on completely building massive neon empires and heavily shooting each other over completely stolen copper pipe, a completely different, highly massive global conflict had already completely forced the absolute top tier of the criminal underworld into an incredibly bizarre, deeply, highly classified partnership entirely directly with the United States government. The true, absolute, highly classified archives of the Second World War contain a massive, heavily suppressed ledger detailing exactly, entirely, how the completely ruthless Mafia was quietly, entirely drafted directly into a massive, completely global war. The freezing waters of the Hudson River violently slammed against the heavy wooden pylons of Pier 88 on the afternoon of February the 9th, 1942. The massive, deeply dark skyline of Manhattan was completely swallowed by a thick, heavy column of deeply black smoke. The French luxury liner SS Normandy, recently heavily seized by the United States government and actively renamed the USS Lafayette for massive troop transport, was entirely consumed by flames. A completely careless civilian worker had accidentally kicked a massive shower of highly bright sparks from a heavy acetylene cutting torch directly into a massive pile of highly flammable Kapok life jackets. The local fire departments aggressively pumped thousands of gallons of freezing river water directly into the upper decks of the massive ship. The heavy water rapidly froze in the bitter winter air, completely destroying the massive center of gravity. The massive 80,000-ton ship violently groaned, completely rolled over onto its heavy port side, and completely sank directly into the freezing river mud. The immediate aftermath of the massive fire sent an absolute wave of deep panic completely through the heavy corridors of the United States government. The Office of Naval Intelligence, specifically the 3rd Naval District, heavily stationed in New York, completely believed the massive ship had been explicitly destroyed by highly trained German saboteurs. The heavy military planners looked entirely out at the massive, sprawling network of the New York docks and completely realized a deeply terrifying logistical fact. The United States Navy had absolutely zero control over its own massive waterfront. The heavy piers were entirely, completely controlled by a highly organized, completely ruthless criminal syndicate. The government completely believed the massive docks were entirely crawling with enemy spies, and they desperately needed to absolutely lock down the deep water ports before massive convoys of heavy troop ships were actively targeted. The military completely attempted to heavily infiltrate the docks using their own highly trained intelligence officers. It was a completely massive failure. The tough, deeply silent Irish and Italian longshoremen completely refused to speak a single word to men wearing crisp federal suits. The local waterfront was entirely heavily controlled by the International Longshoremen's Association, which was absolutely controlled directly by a vicious, deeply violent enforcer named Albert Anastasia. Anastasia answered to absolutely no one in the federal government. He answered completely, entirely to the absolute highest tier of the National Crime Syndicate. The military brass completely realized that to absolutely secure the massive eastern seaboard, they actively had to negotiate directly with the very men they had spent decades attempting to heavily lock inside concrete cages. They needed to completely reach the absolute boss of bosses. They needed Charles Lucky Luciano. We must completely pause the timeline right here to actively open the massive file on exactly how Luciano ended up completely removed from the streets. 6 years earlier, in 1936, a highly ambitious, completely ruthless special prosecutor named Thomas E. Dewey heavily targeted the massive syndicate leader. Dewey is our absolute primary shadow nemesis in this specific massive ledger. Dewey did not actively attempt to completely build a massive, highly complicated case around illegal bootlegging or heavy labor extortion. He aggressively targeted the absolute lowest, deeply dirty floor of the underworld. Dewey completely built a massive, highly public indictment, completely charging Luciano with operating a massive compulsory prostitution ring. Dewey heavily ordered the local plod to violently kick down the heavy wooden doors of dozens of illegal brothels entirely across the massive city. He completely rounded up over 100 terrified sex workers and aggressively threatened them with massive, heavy state prison sentences unless they explicitly entirely testified directly against Luciano. The highly publicized trial was an absolute media circus. Dewey actively paraded the women entirely through the heavy wooden courtroom, completely painting the sophisticated, highly tailored mob boss as an absolute massive pimp. The jury rapidly convicted him. The heavy judge actively handed down an incredibly crushing, absolutely devastating sentence of 30 to 50 years in the state penitentiary. Luciano was completely transported directly to the Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, an absolutely massive, heavily fortified concrete fortress located completely near the freezing Canadian border. The inmates quietly called it the Siberia of New York. The air in the cell blocks constantly smelled completely of heavy industrial bleach, cold iron, and deep human despair. Luciano completely believed he would absolutely die entirely inside that massive freezing cage. But the massive, entirely desperate requirements of the Second World War completely altered his heavy fate. Commander Charles Haffenden of the Office of Naval Intelligence completely swallowed his absolute federal pride and actively reached out directly to the syndicate. Haffenden utilized a highly quiet, deeply calculating mob accountant named Meyer Lansky to heavily broker the massive deal. Lansky aggressively traveled to the freezing visitor room at Dannemora and laid the massive federal offer completely out on the heavily scratched wooden table. The military heavily demanded that the syndicate actively utilize their massive army of street thugs and heavy dock workers to completely secure the waterfront. They heavily demanded an absolute complete end to all union labor strikes, explicitly requiring the mob to heavily aggressively beat any worker who actively attempted to completely slow down the massive loading of heavy military cargo. They also completely required the syndicate to actively utilize their deep network of highly observant street criminals to actively hunt down and completely turn over any suspected foreign saboteurs. In absolute massive exchange, the government completely agreed to entirely look the other way, while the syndicate heavily operated their massive illegal black markets. And they explicitly promised to completely, actively review Luciano's massive prison sentence for a potential executive pardon when the massive war finally ended. I usually entirely keep my absolute neutrality when aggressively pulling these specific government ledgers. But the absolute sheer naked hypocrisy of this massive arrangement is entirely staggering to actively process. The massive United States government, heavily engaged entirely in a massive global war, actively fighting against brutal fascism, explicitly, actively hired a massive domestic syndicate of contract killers and heavy extortionists to completely act as their primary security force. They heavily handed the absolute complete keys of the massive Brooklyn Navy Yard entirely over to men who regularly, actively dumped heavily chained bodies entirely into the freezing East River. The operation was officially deeply classified and heavily dubbed Operation Underworld. Luciano heavily agreed to the massive terms. To explicitly facilitate the heavy ongoing communication, the state completely transferred Luciano from the absolute freezing isolation of Dannemora entirely down to the Great Meadow Correctional Facility in Comstock. It was a significantly more completely comfortable, highly relaxed prison. Luciano was completely allowed to actively hold massive, highly secretive meetings directly in the prison courtyard with massive mob bosses and highly ranked federal intelligence officers. The immediate highly brutal cost of Operation Underworld was completely paid heavily by the legitimate, hard-working civilian men entirely on the docks. We must absolutely open a highly specific, deeply grounded file on a completely innocent man named Michael Santoro. Santoro was a 45-year-old longshoreman. He entirely, completely worked grueling 14-hour shifts, actively hauling massive, heavily splintered wooden crates of heavy munitions and dry goods entirely down into the dark cargo holds of the massive Liberty ships. He completely earned roughly $4 a single day, which absolutely completely equates to exactly $80 in today's modern currency. He had absolutely zero criminal record. He simply completely wanted to actively feed his young children. But entirely under the heavy, completely unregulated rules of Operation Underworld, the massive syndicate was completely granted absolute unchecked physical authority on the heavy piers. One freezing morning, Santoro actively noticed a completely ruthless crew of Anastasia's heavy enforcers actively, deliberately stealing massive crates of highly expensive, heavily rationed military medical supplies meant entirely for the heavy troops bleeding overseas. Santoro did completely not go entirely to the plod. He simply completely asked a minor union steward a single quiet question about the missing crates. At the completely absolute end of his exhausted shift, as Santoro walked slowly completely down a deeply dark freezing service alley near 10th Avenue, 3 heavily armed men stepped quietly entirely out of the deep shadows. They did completely not ask entirely for his thin wallet. They absolutely heavily raised heavy, solid iron crowbars and violently, aggressively shattered both of his knees, completely, permanently crippling a completely hardworking father. The naval intelligence officers who were heavily entirely stationed directly on the massive docks completely explicitly looked the absolute other way. The massive stolen military supplies were aggressively, heavily sold entirely on the highly lucrative black market, completely generating massive, heavy profits entirely for the syndicate, completely under the absolute, explicit protection of the United States flag. As the massive global war heavily aggressively shifted completely directly toward Europe, the military entirely completely realized they desperately needed Luciano for a significantly more massive operation. In 1943, the massive Allied forces completely actively prepared for a highly dangerous, massive amphibious assault entirely on the heavily fortified, deeply rocky island of Sicily. The massive military planners knew absolutely nothing completely about the highly treacherous internal dirt roads, the heavily hidden coastal defenses, or the deeply aggressive local militias. They completely actively went directly back entirely to the boss of bosses. Luciano aggressively heavily utilized his massive, completely unbroken ties to the old world Sicilian Mafia. He completely provided the United States Navy with highly detailed, heavily hand-drawn maps of secret harbor depths and massive, heavily concealed mountain passes. More importantly, he heavily provided a massive list of completely trusted, highly influential mafia contacts within Sicily, specifically massive local dons like Calogero Vizzini. When the massive heavy tanks, completely belonging to General George S. Patton, heavily actively rolled directly onto the dusty, completely sun-baked beaches of Gala during Operation Husky, they were not entirely completely navigating blindly. They were actively, heavily guided completely by local mafia enforcers. The local Sicilian dons completely stood entirely on the side of the heavy dirt roads, actively holding small, heavily stitched yellow flags, completely featuring a single, large black letter L. The massive American tanks completely actively rolled entirely past the heavy German defensive positions, entirely, completely facilitated heavily by a massive network of violent criminals who entirely heavily hated the fascist dictator, Benito Mussolini, completely because the dictator had aggressively, heavily attempted to entirely wipe them out decades earlier. On May the 8th, 1945, the massive, heavy war in Europe completely officially ended. The heavy, completely thick ticker tape entirely covered the crowded streets of New York. Charles Lucky Luciano sat completely quietly, entirely inside his comfortable prison cell, actively carefully packing his highly expensive small leather traveling bags. He completely, entirely expected a massive, highly publicized, full executive pardon entirely for his highly classified, massive, vital service entirely to the country. He completely, absolutely expected to actively walk entirely directly out of the heavy iron prison gates and completely, entirely resume his massive, absolute position completely at the head of the Heavy Commission. He severely, completely, fatally underestimated the massive, highly aggressive political ambitions of his absolute shadow nemesis. Thomas E. Dewey was absolutely, completely no longer just a special prosecutor. He was the heavily, entirely elected governor of New York, and he was aggressively, completely, actively planning a massive, highly funded run entirely for the presidency of the United States. Dewey completely, entirely knew that actively, officially pardoning a massive, highly notorious mafia boss would completely, absolutely destroy his entire massive political career overnight. But he also completely, absolutely knew he could not entirely ignore the highly classified, heavily documented deal the federal military had completely, actively made with the massive syndicate. Dewey completely aggressively made a highly calculated, absolutely devastating, massive political compromise. On January the 3rd, 1946, Dewey officially completely commuted Luciano's massive, heavy sentence. But he actively, heavily attached a massive, entirely non-negotiable, explicit condition. Charles Luciano was to be completely, immediately, entirely, permanently deported directly back to Italy. He was completely, absolutely stripped entirely of his massive American residency and explicitly, completely, actively banned entirely from ever setting a single foot on United States soil ever again. Luciano was absolutely, completely, entirely furious. He had completely built a massive, highly lucrative neon and concrete empire completely from nothing, and it was aggressively, completely ripped entirely out from under him. He was completely placed entirely under heavy armed federal guard, completely transported directly to a freezing Brooklyn pier, and heavily, entirely loaded directly onto the SS Laura Keene, a massive heavy freighter, completely bound entirely for the port of Naples. He stood completely silently, entirely on the freezing metal deck, actively looking entirely at the massive, towering skyscrapers of Manhattan, a massive, violent empire he had completely built with heavy lead and raw cash rapidly entirely. Completely fading entirely into the gray, heavy winter fog, he completely aggressively spent the absolute entire rest of his life as a completely displaced, highly heavily monitored exile. He desperately, completely, entirely attempted to actively, completely regain control entirely from afar. In December of 1946, he completely, secretly traveled entirely to Havana, Cuba, aggressively, actively organizing the massive, highly secretive Havana Conference entirely with Meyer Lansky and Frank Costello. He completely, entirely attempted to actively run the massive American syndicate entirely from a highly expensive, deeply luxurious hotel suite just 90 miles completely off the heavily guarded coast of Florida. But the massive federal government completely heavily caught wind of the massive operation. They aggressively, actively threatened to completely, entirely embargo all highly necessary, massive medical supplies entirely to the island of Cuba, completely, unless the Cuban government aggressively, entirely expelled Luciano. Immediately, the Cuban military authorities heavily, violently forced him completely directly back entirely onto a massive ship completely bound for Italy. The absolute final years of the massive boss of bosses were entirely, completely pathetic. He lived completely in a highly expensive, massive apartment, entirely in Naples, but he was completely, absolutely, entirely cut off from the massive, heavy rivers of raw cash that heavily flowed through New York. He completely spent his long days aggressively, actively wandering the local, highly crowded cafes, heavily, entirely complaining completely to absolutely anyone who would actively listen entirely about how the massive American government had completely, entirely used him and violently, completely thrown him completely away like heavy garbage. He was completely, constantly, heavily, intensely monitored entirely by the Italian National Police and massive teams of federal narcotics agents. He was entirely, completely stripped absolutely of his massive, highly terrifying power, completely entirely reduced, absolutely to a highly recognizable, deeply pathetic tourist attraction, entirely for visiting American sailors who completely wanted to actively buy him a cheap drink, which completely heavily brings us entirely directly to the absolute exact geographic coordinates of his completely final moments. January the 26th, 1962, the heavy, deeply damp winter air completely entirely filled the massive, heavily echoing concrete terminal of the Capodichino Airport, entirely in Naples. Charles Luciano was exactly 64 years old. He was deeply, heavily, completely bored, and entirely, absolutely desperate for massive, heavy public recognition. He had completely, actively agreed to heavily, entirely meet with a highly successful American film producer completely named Martin Gosch. Gosch wanted to explicitly, completely discuss making a massive, highly romanticized, heavily fictionalized Hollywood movie entirely about his deeply violent life. Luciano completely walked slowly entirely across the highly polished, completely massive terrazzo floor of the entirely crowded airport terminal. He was completely wearing a highly crisp, deeply expensive tailored suit. He completely actively saw the massive producer, heavily entirely, walking completely toward him entirely, near the heavy customs gate. Luciano completely aggressively raised his right hand to actively completely wave. He did completely, not entirely, finish the absolute gesture. A massive, completely catastrophic physical failure completely violently ruptured his heavily damaged heart. The absolute sheer massive physical agony violently, entirely tore completely, directly through his heavy chest. He aggressively completely dropped his highly expensive small leather briefcase entirely onto the hard floor. He violently, completely collapsed, entirely face first, completely onto the highly polished, extremely hard airport floor. There were completely, absolutely no heavy, philosophical final words. There was entirely, absolutely no highly dramatic, poetic reflection, completely on a life built entirely on massive, violent extortion and highly classified military espionage. The man who had aggressively, completely, entirely ordered the brutal, highly bloody executions of dozens of men entirely on the busy, completely crowded streets of New York, the absolute massive primary architect of the entire modern American. Mafia simply, completely, entirely stopped breathing completely on the dirty, heavily scuffed floor of a massive public transit hub. He completely died, entirely surrounded completely by deeply panicked, completely anonymous tourists, actively carrying heavy leather luggage. The local Italian emergency medical technicians completely, officially, entirely pronounced him completely dead, exactly, entirely upon immediate arrival at the local city hospital. The massive cold facts of the immediate aftermath completely heavily strip away any lingering glamour. The absolute massive, highly classified federal files entirely on Operation Underworld were heavily, completely buried entirely by the United States Navy for absolute decades. The heavy military brass actively, entirely, completely denied the massive arrangement entirely until the Freedom of Information Act completely heavily forced the massive, deeply embarrassing documents entirely into the public light. The massive shadow nemesis Thomas E. Dewey entirely, completely lost his massive, highly funded presidential bid directly to Harry Truman in 1948, completely, absolutely failing to entirely reach the absolute highest office he so deeply, heavily craved. He died completely, entirely, of a massive sudden heart attack while heavily actively packing entirely for a highly expensive golf trip in 1971. Albert Anastasia, the completely brutal, highly violent lord of the massive docks who actively, completely terrorized innocent, hard-working men like Michael Santoro, completely did not survive to entirely enjoy his massive, heavy power. In October of 1957, he was violently, completely shot entirely to death, completely by two heavily armed assassins, completely while sitting entirely, completely relaxed entirely in a heavy leather barber chair, completely at the Park Sheraton Hotel, entirely in Manhattan. Meyer Lansky, the highly calculating accountant who completely actively brokered the massive wartime deal, completely fled the aggressive federal government entirely for absolute decades, desperately, completely attempting to heavily secure permanent citizenship entirely in Israel before being completely forcefully, entirely returned completely to Miami, where he died entirely completely of terminal lung cancer in 1983. The heavy, massive steel doors of the Underworld archives are finally completely swinging entirely shut for this massive, deeply bloody session. The absolute 10 ledgers we have actively, completely opened entirely prove that massive extreme violence completely entirely buys a highly expensive suit, but it absolutely completely guarantees a deeply pathetic, highly heavily, completely isolated end. I completely, sincerely want to actively thank every single one of you completely for sitting heavily through this massive, highly granular historical autopsy. If you completely appreciate the absolute cold facts, completely stripped entirely of the massive Hollywood myth, please completely actively hit that subscribe button and leave a heavy like completely on the video. It completely, entirely tells the algorithm to actively keep funding these massive deep dives. Join our completely highly active Discord server, completely linked entirely in the description below, to actively heavily suggest the next massive case files you completely want me to actively tear completely apart. Until next time, completely heavily double check your deadbolts and absolutely completely stay out of the deep shadows.